Please remember that when things get rough, you could always leave over there and come here to Sankofa Books and sit down and relax. Because this is the liberation space and the liberation zone.
Welcome to Framing Question 4, the next lecture for Introduction to Afro-American Studies, Greg Carr, Howard University. Now, in full partnership and collaboration with Sankofa Video and Books. So Brother Gazal here and I are here on a Sunday morning. You may be watching this whenever. You're watching it years from now, understand that, yes, black people won, and now we're running the world. So you can look back on these old videos as a quaint time when the world was out of order, but we've restored it. But for now, yes, we are continuing. Howard students, you will be watching this during the, I guess that would be the third week of March 2020. Of course, we will go from here to Framing Question 5, but we're going to finish up this lecture. This is the third, actually, in the series that we've recorded so far, the fourth in the sequence for Framing Question 4. How did Africans begin to conceptualize unity in thought beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism? We won't review in this one. If you want to look at the previous questions, you can do that, of course, scrolling back through the videos that are all posted and will continue to be posted, new material on the Sankofa YouTube channel. So make sure you subscribe, and that goes for everybody who's not enrolled in the class as well. All right, let's continue. So where we left off, our last time together, we were actually opening with returning to Framing Question 4, Chapter 4 of Black Movements in America. Cedric J. Robinson, the great scholar whose book we used. And parenthetically, for those of you who are not enrolled in the class and watching this, there is no Africana Studies textbook that, in my mind, fits the real declarative mandate at the beginning of the founding of this field as an academic discipline to articulate the disciplinary structure of our field of study. There have been some magnificent books, some incredible work that has been done over the arc, and maybe, depending on how long this work continues in this format, we'll sit down and have a conversation about the intellectual history of the field that would match some of what we get a chance to talk about in real time in the Afro-American Studies courses, including the one that I teach here at Howard. Actually, this is beautiful. We've been joined by the general. He tried to stick his head in. That was Haile Garima. Some of y'all know who that is. If you're watching the Sankofa video channel, you absolutely know who that is. But we're in his house. He and Shrikiana, his wife, their house. And of course, as I said, Brother Gazal is here. That don't need to be edited out. That's real time. I'm loving this because we're jailbreaking the Black University. This is where it should be anyway. One of the places it should be anyway. So, and actually, that's actually a good reminder. The books that I'm mentioning, and for those of you who may have never attended a class that I've taught at Howard or anywhere else, or any of the Philadelphia Freedom School classes, or any of the other spaces that I'm fortunate enough to share some time and space in, you know that I name a lot of books. I mention a lot of texts because at the center of study is digging into those texts and having real-time conversations. So this is an opportunity for you to go to the Sankofa.com website and actually order books that I am talking about. And we'll have more to say about that as we continue over the arc of this social gathering, even as we're engaged in physical distancing. But we're going to get a little closer on this. So, Framing Question 4. We stopped in our last talk with this slide. And understand these slides are just accentuating the text that the students are reading. Students enrolled in the class, you all know that these talks that we have when we gather in class, we're not going over line by line the texts. That's your job. And my job to reread and reread and reread. But, we come to class so that we can outline some of the broad themes and touch on some of the things that kind of relate to the texts. But we know, as we've talked about many times in class, students, that there are three authorities in the classroom: the text, the student, and the teacher. And at any given moment, that kind of authority can shift depending on what's controlling. So we'll start this talk with the text, Chapter 4 of Cedric Robinson's Black Movements in America. And for Howard students, as you know, as I informed y'all at the beginning of class, and as you will be receiving on Blackboard, there will be some draft text pages to kind of accompany these lectures so that we can do that. And then, of course, we'll be having office hours on Zoom and a couple of real-time interactions where folks, wherever you are, can log in and we can have a question and answer session. And we'll be doing that regularly. I haven't decided whether it's going to be once a week or twice a week, whether it's going to be 3 or 4 hours once a week, or maybe a couple of hours twice a week. But we'll figure that out. And I'll be emailing you all. So, Chapter 4, the Civil War and its aftermath. Remember, how did Africans conceptualize unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries? This framing question has a time-space anchor from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century. So from the 1850s or 60s until the 19-teens, 1920s or so. That is the literal anchor. But as we know, the expression of unity in thought and action, as we've covered in the previous lectures, kind of extends backward in time to Africans being forced into seeing each other beyond their kind of parochial local identities by the largest forced migration in human history. And that, of course, Howard students, to remind you, really we set the anchors for that very early in the semester with these two books, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Something Torn and New, Wole Soyinka's Of Africa, followed by another continental African, Kwei Armah, The Eloquence of the Scribes, followed by another brother African born in Arkansas, Professor at Clark Atlanta University, Daniel Black, whose novel, The Coming, historical novel, brings us across that water. So all that's been gestating, and we talked about that in the lecture immediately previous to this one. But now we have arrived, framing question 4, in this little 3/4 of a century window. So let's set the stage for that. We know that this is an Introduction to Afro-American Studies course, so that we know this conversation we're having, while it involves Africana globally, and Howard students, you know, we define Africana as Africa when and wherever you find it. So we know that it's a global conversation, and we've been putting it and having it in a global context, and you know the texts lead us to that. But we also know that it is anchored in the experience of African people in what has now become the United States by the mid-19th century. So here we are. So we talk a little bit about state formation beginning with this. The United States, the formation of the modern U.S. state. And we kind of talked about a lot of this in the previous lecture, so there will be no need to really go into great detail. I'm just starting here because it's where we stopped. From 1860 to 1865, we know there's a United States Civil War. That war, of course, the secession of the southern states and the unrest in some of the quote-unquote northern states. We know the Mason-Dixon line separates Delaware and Pennsylvania. So that's north of where we're sitting right now in Washington, D.C., but theoretically we don't typically think of the South as involving Delaware, even though all you good AME church Negroes out there know that's Richard and Sarah Allen. They were enslaved in Delaware before they came across to Pennsylvania. But the unrest in the northern states has a couple of sources, many different sources, but two I'll identify and then keep going. In the northern states, as we get to the 1850s, the decade of the 1850s, and then the 1860s, is I'll start with the most obvious one first, and that is sympathy for enslavement. We talked about Baltimore a little bit yesterday, Maryland, which was a southern state, home of Harriet Tubman, home Araminta, known as Harriet Tubman, Harriet Ross Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Frederick Bailey, then Frederick Douglass. Two statues, by the way, that are now in the Maryland State House. Shout out to those statues. When they lift this stuff, go see them. So we know then, of course, Richard and Sarah Allen are in Delaware, along with many other people. The Christiana Rebellion of enslaved Africans in Delaware. So there's sympathy for enslavement in what we would consider border states. And then when you go into places like New York or even into the Northeast, Massachusetts and other places, strong abolitionist communities, but also pro-enslavement communities there as well. So that's one thrust. It's one reason why you still have some problems in the North. The other one I'll mention is, there are business interests in the North that are tied very deeply to the business interests of enslavement in the South. In fact, in any number of books you could read about this. You could read about the history of New York City and enslavement, for example, and the New York City draft riots, which, of course, Howard students, you would go to your map book and go into a previous unit, and we would see during the period of the Civil War the New York City draft riots. Root and Branch. It's actually a very good book. The name of the author escapes me at the moment, but Root and Branch is a book that talks about the history of blacks in New York City, and the New York City draft riots occur when white folks are drafted to fight in the Civil War. They're drafted into the Civil War, and so what you see, 1863, these white folks, many of them first-generation immigrants from places like Ireland and other places like that. Well, Ireland typically. They're like, go to the South and fight. Wait, what? What are you talking about? In fact, if you've seen the Martin Scorsese's film Gangs in New York, you remember the cats getting off the boat, and they're getting right off the boat and being recruited into the Union Army. He's like, where's Tennessee? What? I'm going where to fight? So of course the backlash is acted out on black people. They burned the colored orphans asylum in New York. The reason I mentioned the book Root and Branch is because there's a description of how these black women who had been washing clothes, among other things, in New York, washerwomen, so to speak, in the social structure category, black women who were employed in the laundry industry and the governance structure, who are they to each other? But they get on the roof of one of the buildings as these mobs are coming into New York to find black people and kill them, to lynch them, and they boil up a concoction in those big vats they're usually putting clothes in. They boil hot water and lye and nails and all kind of stuff. They call it the King of Pain. And they dump that stuff on these white boys coming down the street trying to lynch black people. So there's literally race war in New York as a result, because there's pro-New York sympathy. But the reason I mention it as well is because during this period, some of the citizens of New York go to the mayor of New York and say, you got to go to the governor in Albany, New York. And yeah, this ain't Andrew Cuomo, it's the 1860s. And they say, you need to tell the governor he needs to get New York State to secede when the South secedes. Because if the South secedes, we're going to lose, in terms of supply chain, a lot of the raw materials and the goods that we are getting shipped that go out of New York Harbor. So there's these tensions in the North and the South. So when you talk about the Civil War, 1860 to 1865, in fact, let's go to our map book briefly. And if you look, Howard students, you're following along, map 72. Map 72 is at the end of Unit 5. The wealth of northern and southern states before and after the Civil War. At the start of the Civil War, the South had an economy that was based on agriculture, specifically cotton. Parenthetically, a lot of the back and forth that was started by the 1619 Project in August of 2019 had to do with the economic ties between enslavement, the labor of enslaved Africans, and the American economy. So I would encourage you all to go look at that stuff as well, and the work of Sven Berkitz and so many other people we could talk about, but we'll go back to the map book. Those states that produced the most cotton were the wealthiest in the South and the nation. The North's economy, on the other hand, was fairly diverse, and he goes on. But he's really talking about in this map the wealth of the South, the material wealth, and how it's connected to the North. One other thing I'll mention is on the eve of the Civil War, 1860, the bodies of black people, the bodies of people of African descent, about 4 million people enslaved in this country at the time of African descent, were worth more, just the bodies, and we talked about property earlier, were worth more than all the money in the banks and all the real property in the country. Just the bodies of black people. Think about that in terms of when we think about the value of black people. Now imagine, going back for a moment to W.E.B. Du Bois's magisterial Black Reconstruction in America, what happens when you say these Africans are going to transition from owned property to human beings? Well, there are economic interests at stake, which is why one of the reasons in the 1850s that the Republican Party, the grand old party, was founded in part to preserve the interests of business, northern interests. And when you look at the election patterns of the elections, 1856, 1860, you see 1864, you see the presidential elections, that is, you see real fear in this new party, because there's a collapse of the parties that have come before that. We're not going to get too deep in the weeds about this because this is really extended beyond the scope of the framing question, but just wanted to set that as a context for 1860, 1865, the U.S. Civil War. There's real fear in this emergent political party that the South will indeed secede. And so part of the interest of keeping the Union together is a business interest coming out of the North, and a political party that emerges to protect that business interest. And that's one thing about the Republicans that hasn't changed from that day to now. They are the party of business. And enslavement, they may not have been philosophically opposed to enslavement, but in some ways, as we're transitioning in the kind of economic structure of the United States, slavery was deemed to be something that perhaps could be gotten rid of. And if you look at that map that I just referred to, the wealth of northern states before and after the Civil War, the wealthiest states in the country were in the South until the end of the Civil War. And by the year after the Civil War, by 1865, 1866, none of the wealthiest states in the country are in the South. The South has been subdued economically. The South has been subdued politically. The South has been subdued militarily, first and foremost, by the hands of Union soldiers, of which close to 200,000 in the military between the Army and the Navy were of African descent formally, not counting all those people who just stopped working, as Du Bois said, and helped collapse the Southern economy. So they were subdued militarily. Culturally, there's probably an argument to be made that the South won the Civil War, but we can talk about that another time. As Donald Trump would say, our country. So we continue, 1865 to 1876, Reconstruction. Of course, this is the period when the South is further subdued. Railroad interests coming in, little places where there used to be switching stations for railroads, like Atalanta, as Du Bois might call it. Thinking about souls of black folk on the wings of Atalanta, but Atlanta, as we call it. Atlanta then begins to emerge as a very important economic center in the South for continuing the business of business. Reconstruction during this period, and black folks serve a very important role. Black folks have their own interests. We think about the governance structure. Who are Africans to each other? You've got the Africans entering a moment of political consciousness and awareness. The 15th Amendment extends the right to vote to black men. Problematic, of course, because no women were included, and that's when you see some of the white women abolitionists arguing that you should give the vote to your wives and daughters before you give it to Sambo, meaning the black man. Black women, of course, wanted to vote. Eventually, in the struggle to acquire the vote for women, leading to the 19th Amendment, still excluding black women, as we know, because even though they had the legal right to vote, it was still being suppressed in many places in this country, primarily the South, not exclusively, by these states and their Jim Crow laws. But we see Sojourner Truth, of course. You read Nell Irvin Painter's book on Sojourner Truth. You read Sojourner Truth, the transcript of her speech. And as folks, Deborah Gray White and many others have led us to know, including, Sister Nell Irvin Painter, Isabella, we know it's Sojourner Truth, from New York, so she probably wouldn't have been saying ain't, but, am I not a woman? Aren't I a woman? She's asking this question. In other words, yes, I'm black and I'm a woman, and ultimately, later on as they're arguing about the so-called right to vote, she's saying, well, I'm a woman too, I should be voting as well. But these tensions are beginning to emerge during the Reconstruction period. Sojourner Truth's speech a little bit earlier than that, but ultimately these tensions are moving in Reconstruction, because as black men acquire the right to vote, voting in the interests of black people, often in consultation with women and with their communities, they're exercising the vote. You see black elected officials. One poignant story, and I'll move on very quickly, is that of Henry McNeil Turner out of Georgia, who is elected to the Georgia legislature and then prevented from taking his seat in a gesture that would be, you see something, different time, same sentiment, I'm sure. Julian Bond, he wouldn't let him sit, say he's too young. But in Henry McNeil Turner's case, he's standing in Atlanta saying, gives a famous speech where he says, God himself would not come down from heaven and pass judgment on my manhood. So why would I let one of you buckra was one of the choice terms at the time applied to white people, pass judgment on my manhood? Why would you think I would let you do that? Now, Henry Turner is talking smack like that in the Reconstruction period. It's very, very, very powerful. I mean, read Du Bois, read Foner, Freedom's Lawmakers, which kind of gives a compendium of all these black elected officials at the state level, the local level. But probably one of my favorite books is one that started life as a serialized series of essays in Ebony magazine, by the man that some people call Black America's historian. That would be the great Lerone Bennett Jr., who you've heard me mention before. Read Black Power USA, among others. But Lerone Bennett Jr.'s Black Power USA, which opens in the South Carolina state legislature. Those of you in South Carolina, of course, are familiar with that magisterial monument that the sculptor Ed Dwight famous sculptor. He's got a sculpture in Union Station of A. Philip Randolph. We'll talk about Randolph maybe in a subsequent lecture in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Chambermaids. But Ed Dwight has a beautiful panoramic bronze sculpture of the history of Africans in South Carolina that kind of came into existence in the wake of the fight over the Confederate flag that used to fly off the top of the dome of South Carolina, the battle flag of the Confederates. But you see in that bronze the moments of Africans in the South Carolina legislature there in Columbia, South Carolina during Reconstruction. And you, when you read Lerone Bennett's Black Power USA, you get a real feel for these people like Robert Elliott, the great Robert Smalls. And if you remember our students reading about Robert Smalls in Black Movements in America, the hero of the planter. Y'all know what the planter is. If you don't, look it up. That's a movie somebody needs to play. Denzel can't play every role, but I promise you I'd love to have seen him play Robert Smalls when he locked the white captain of the planter up and said, we're going to steam this thing past Confederate lines. No punks on this ship today. But black men are in these legislatures, but they are representing the Republican Party because it is in the interest of the Republican Party to empower black people in the South to maintain this ability to reconstruct the South in the business interests of the North. Ultimately, they're going to make up with some of these Southern business interests, some of the old plantocracy, but a new economic interest that's going to emerge in the South that really is relying on cheap labor, black and white, but of course anchored in black. This is going to be that debt peonage we talked about, so-called sharecropping. So this is what's going on in the United States during this period. And that's what I mean now when we talk about 1877 and 1901. Reconciliation. Again, I mentioned the work of David Blight, Race and Reunion. So many others have written about this. And of course, we started with the man for whom the next chapter is named, Rayford Logan, who talks about the nadir, the dark point. Howard University professor of history, friends with Carter G. Woodson and W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the assistants to Du Bois and co-strugglers with Du Bois in the Pan-African movement. Very important brother, wrote an important book on relationships between the United States and Haiti. A lot of things going on. Rayford Whittingham Logan calls this the dark point because once the North and the South reconcile, particularly the white elites, what is sacrificed? To use the language of the great African-American legal scholar Derrick Bell, there's an involuntary sacrifice. What is sacrificed? Black political interests. So this is the period, as we talked about in the previous lecture, where you see voter suppression in the South, where you see racial terror in the South. An organization that was founded just after the Civil War ended in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee, by Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, among others, old Confederate soldier called the Ku Klux Klan, is riding high here. In fact, during Reconstruction under President Ulysses S. Grant, 1870, the Second Klan Act is passed, and they established something called the Department of Justice. And you see the Ku Klux Klan trials. They're after the Klan. But that work is going to recede in importance in this period of reconciliation and then a nadir for Africans. Think of reconciliation in the social structure. Who are Africans to other people? They're expendable. Think of the nadir in the governance structure. Who are Africans to each other? A group that's really going to have to regroup now and begin to think beyond their allegiances to any particular social structure they find themselves in. By the end of this period, 1901, you begin to see Africans begin to leave the South. There's a boll weevil infestation that occurs. If you know what a boll weevil is, I'm from Tennessee, so I'm saying that like it's one word. Like in D.C., the way they say Marion Berry, like it's one word. So let me stop, slow down. B-O-L-L, one word. W-E-E-V-I-L, two words. Boll weevil, little bitty kind of critter that goes into the ball of a cotton plant, eats its way out. It's destroying the cotton crop. And again, one thing, you can't really replace online education, because if I mention boll weevil in a classroom at Howard with black students, it's very interesting to see the students from the Caribbean begin to identify that similar critter in the Caribbean with a different name. But it's very interesting because some Southern students in that classroom invariably know what a boll weevil is. And some of y'all do, Howard students, as you're talking about this. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. But that's one of the push factors that pushes Africans out of the South, beginning during this period, which is a stream of migration that we're going to see turn into a flood by the end of Framing Question 4's period into that first quarter of the so-called 20th century, the so-called Great Migrations. Whether you read Isabel Wilkerson's very good book, The Warmth of Other Suns, where she talks about these migration patterns by tracing African people from several different places in the South, Georgia and Florida and Mississippi and Texas. She takes these 4 lives and then follows these routes out. Whether you read her book, Nicholas Layman, The Promised Land, so much work that has been done about the Great Migrations. And then you have the fact that during this period, the federal constitution is amended 3 important times, 13, 14, and 15, as we talked about. But because of the reconciliation and the nadir, which persists into the 20th century, you get Africans have to really mount a second reconstruction during this period. This is the period typically you learn in school as the civil rights movement. But what that really is a thrust where Africans say, we got to make these Civil War amendments stand up and have meaning. And they're appealing to the federal government. As the great Ralph Johnson Bunch once wrote, the Negro is a special ward of the Supreme Court, meaning what? Judge-made law, interpretation of these laws, interpretations of new statutes that are pursuant to the Civil War amendments. So the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, all those acts are pursuant to, in fact, there's a Civil Rights Act actually 1957 and then another one in 1964, are pursuant to the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, and 15. And Africans are in the streets now. We got to make this stand up. So we continue again. And then from 1965, ironically the year I was born, but that's not why that's there. That's actually there because the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. To the present, I call this period balkanization and reformation, because what you see is as the demographics in the United States of America change, and really the demographics around the world continue to change, you see the United States with these emerging tensions that are directly connected to how non-white people are treated. We talk so-called immigration challenges. This is the year, 1965 as well, of the passage of the Immigration and Naturalization Act, the federal act. This is the period after which, folks like Jeff Sessions of Alabama and others have been really fighting. They've been really fighting to kind of roll back this period's progressive view of, among other things, immigration. There's really no immigration policy that's a federal policy that has real teeth in it in terms of a broad scope prior to the Immigration and Naturalization Act, although there's a lot of anti-non-white legislation that's passed as early as 1883, the Chinese Exclusion Act, but that's a conversation for another day. But my point is that after this period, now from 65 to the present, the past 5.5 decades or so, what you really have is a situation where this country is changing demographically into something that some folks who are trying to preserve this kind of white-facing, white-centered national concept are finding very disconcerting. It was never real. It's the great Langston Hughes once wrote in his poem, America never was America to me, but this I vow America will be. And the America he's talking about isn't an America that ever existed. It's an aspirational concept. I think sometimes it's overburdened, in fact, in terms of these aspirations. Why do you need to use the word America? Because, to quote another book edited by Brother Robin Kelly, Freedom Dreams. Some of you are watching this, if you grew up in Philadelphia Freedom Schools, we read that book one summer. These freedom dreams, these dreams of African people and other people exceed the boundaries of the definition of America, exceed the aspirations really of America. So when people are talking about America, you should ask them, what do they mean? What are they talking about? And what you'll find is the word might be the same, but the concepts are very different. And during this period, you have balkanization and fracture of a lot of this. So let's back this up with a few, show and tell visuals. Y'all know your Howard students don't like PowerPoint. I'm only doing this because try to keep y'all off your laptops, but now everybody is on the laptop, so therefore you got to watch it. All right. Just by way of very quick reviews, there's some pictures to back up some of this stuff. There's Harriet Ross Tubman again. Harriet Tubman, of course, Araminta, born and raised on the eastern shore of Maryland, gets her first lessons on how to navigate territory by looking at the stars from her father and his friends out there in the field. People think she's some kind of magical Negro. You're good for magical Negroes in America, especially in the movies. But she's not a magical Negro. She's an African, Araminta, West African name. Here she is with some of the people. Here she is with some of the people that she's led to getting out of enslavement. She jailbroke America. And then, of course, I love what Robert Williams. Some of y'all know the name Robert F. Williams. Robert and Mabel Williams. So glad. I never got a chance to meet Robert Williams, but I got a chance to meet and spend a little time with Mabel Williams. True gangsters. Love those two, man. If you get a chance, read Robert Williams' book, Negroes with Guns. Some of the work of Timothy Tyson, Radio Free Dixie. These are Africans who ended up in Cuba with Fidel Castro, among others. But, Robert Williams, the great Robert Williams, who ended up, when he passed away in Michigan, he said, I'm a revolutionary. And these are Africans who really we attached to the 1960s and 70s, the Black Power movement. We'll talk about that in the subsequent framing question. In fact, framing question 5, how did Africans make sense of and participate in international developments? We'll talk about them in that period, framing question 5. But the reason I bring them up now, when I'm looking at this picture of Harriet Ross Tubman at Araminta, Robert Williams, when asked, about the goals of being a revolutionary, he said, I'm a revolutionary. He said, I want to die the way George Washington died. I want to fight my war, win my war, go to my farm, sit on my porch, and die of old age. And so this idea that all the revolutionaries got killed, yes, we know many people got killed. This woman right here, gangster revolutionary, the one that Robert Hayden in his poem Renegade called, what did he say? Rises from their anguish and their power. Harriet Tubman, whip-scarred, woman of earth, a summoning, a shining, mean to be free. Robert Hayden, the great poet, renegade. This woman had a price on her head. If you remember in Black Movements in America, John Brown, the white man out of the Northeast who ended up in Kansas, radical Kansas, and then ended up dying at Harper's Ferry along with a couple of his sons and some black people, and then there were some black people who survived. Shields Green, Dangerfield Newby said, I'll go with the old man. The great John Brown. John Brown said, Harriet Tubman was more man than any man that he ever met. Now, of course, using the gendered language of the time, we know that he considered that a compliment. But of course, we know in the African community that it's probably nothing stronger than the woman, black woman. And I'm not saying that in a patriarchal way. I'm saying that as a recognition that I've yet to see a man give birth. And I'm not even saying that in terms of matriarchy. I am saying that, however, to say that Harriet Tubman is one of the strongest human beings in American history of any background. And she died like Robert Williams died, of old age. This is her as an elder. She bought a house, Auburn, New York. She was a faithful member of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in the Ways of Knowing category. She believed in God, and she believed, and on her faith she stretched out, and she bought a house, and she created a space, and her parents were among those who were in this house, at this house, and on these grounds. She said, I'm going to create a retirement home for ex-slaves. Look at her. Wow. She died of old age. Footnote, Howard students, you won't remember this. Y'all weren't alive, but you have to study it. Some people watching this may remember the so-called Iraq War. I think this is his name was Shoshana Johnson. Remember Jessica Lynch, the young white soldier who they said performed so heroically they found out it was a hoax. And then the other sister was out there who actually was working in support capacity in Iraq, and she was shot at and shot, legs shot up. And, she actually both ended up writing books. But during this time, some school children from New York City traveled to Auburn, New York. And if you ever get a chance to go to Harriet Tubman's house, you should. The AME Zion Church runs it in conjunction with the National Park Service. I've been there many times. And when they went on a school trip, they were at Harriet Tubman's house when the caretakers, the keepers of the house, were telling these school children from New York City that Harriet Tubman directed troops in battle, Combahee River, helped liberate Africans. And then they talked about the fact that she was never technically a member of the United States military. She wasn't an enlisted soldier, no women in the military at the time. Sojourner Truth worked as a nurse in Freedman's Village. Those of you from D.C. area, there's a whole story behind where Arlington National Cemetery came from, and then across the river in Alexandria, but we won't talk about that now. Howard students, you all are familiar with that from the readings, but Harriet Tubman, her husband, the guy she had to leave before the war, her husband was in the Army, and she was supposed to get a widow's pension. She's supposed to get her husband's pension. She never got it. The school children found out in New York. They came back to the city and petitioned through their teacher. They petitioned the junior senator from New York at the time, a woman named Hillary Rodham Clinton, and said Harriet Tubman needed to get her money. They could support the house. And actually, because of the efforts of these young people, spurred by these young people joining others, Harriet Tubman's pension was eventually given, and it went to help the Harriet Tubman home. Very important to understand. But she died of old age. Kind of speak this a little bit. I know there was a recent movie on Harriet Tubman. I would encourage those of you who have never seen this one. Harriet Tubman was played in a multi-hour television series called A Woman Called Moses by the great Cicely Tyson. I should watch that one. Harriet Ross Tubman, that is the merchant marine ship, the Harriet Tubman, that was named for her in the 20th century. This is the statue of Harriet Tubman that is in Harlem. Those of you, actually, it's very interesting because on this side, like if we were standing on this side of it, looking from this side, there's a police station over here. So she's actually still escaping. But at any rate, Harriet Tubman, of course, is a very important figure. Who is she to the social structure of her time? She's a criminal. She's a domestic terrorist. Who is she to African people at the time? She's a liberator. The difference between the social structure and the governance structure. And then movement and memory. How do people remember that experience? Well, for Africans, we're very clear about who this is, which is why we take this concept of anytime there's art around her, we're going to fight about it because we have an icon, a figure of, in many ways, uncritical praise. It's a little different for how the social structure remembers her because now she's a hero, even though at the time she was considered by many people a terrorist, even people who are sympathetic. Let's continue. This, of course, is Fred Douglass. Like Harriet Tubman, born on the eastern shore of Maryland, back and forth between Baltimore, eventually escapes with the deep help of his wife Anna. People know that late in life he married a white woman, Miss Pitts, but Frederick Douglass's wife Anna was really the one who was already free, was already working, and it was her material resources and her support that allowed him to do much of what he did. The great Mary Ann Shadd Cary. I mentioned her in the previous lecture, the one immediately before this, coming from a very important family of black abolitionists. Mary Ann Shadd Cary, been a couple of very good books about her. She was a writer. She published a newspaper in Canada, Ontario. Very important figure. Just some 19th century folks. The great Henry Highland Garnet. How did Africans make sense of and participate in international developments? Garnet, man, this is an important dude. In fact, Garnet and Douglass were friends, but also they kind of differed on a couple of things. Henry Garnet was a teenager, late teens, working on ships between New York City up and down the East Coast. Remember that fugitive slave law of 1850 we talked about? There was an incident where Henry Garnet came home off the boats, and white boys had come to his father's house, to his family's house in New York, knocking on doors, trying to take them into enslavement. And when the family answered the door and found out these white dudes was trying to take them into enslavement, they started running. So a couple jumped out the window on the second floor. They took some of them back into enslavement. Henry Garnet got home, found out his family had been broken up, bought the biggest knife he could find, and his friends had to stop him from walking the streets of New York because he said he was going to kill as many white people as he could. Thank God they stopped him, because Henry Garnet would end up being one of the most important thinkers of the 19th century. How did and do Africans make sense of and participate in international developments? Henry Garnet wrote a very famous address to the slaves of America that they put together with David Walker's appeal, which had been written about 30 years before, and they published them together. This address was actually given at one of the Negro conventions. We haven't talked about this in the lectures, but those of you who've been following in the books, Howard students, you know about the Negro Convention movement. It goes back to Richard and Sarah Allen in Philadelphia and the 1830s, and then comes forward into the 1840s and 50s. These are the so-called free blacks who are debating what to do. And one of the things that they talk about, and this, of course, is in Cedric Robinson's one of the things he kind of touches on, there's a lot of scholarship on this, but if you remember Howard Students Chapter 3, Free Blacks and Resistance, the second big section, the Black Abolitionists, and the third section, Black Sovereignty. They're saying we want self-determining black communities. That's where a lot of these black communities come from in the United States. It's like Weeksville in Brooklyn, kind of goes back before that, but that's an important place. And then some of them are saying we should leave the United States. Remember we talked about Delaney and Campbell. We'll talk about Delaney again in a moment. They're going to go to Africa. Some people are saying let's go to the Caribbean. Hell, even Lincoln, when you read the Lincoln Scholarship and really look at my man Lerone Bennett Jr.'s book, Forced into Glory, Lincoln at one point was like, yeah, we could free them and then send them out of the country. maybe Haiti. I don't know about Haiti. Haiti, by the way, was recognized by the United States as a country for the first time during the Civil War, 1863. Because one of the options maybe is just let these Negroes leave. At first, just let the free blacks leave, the American colonization societies, get them out the country. Why? We don't want them making solidarity with the enslaved Africans. One of the options Lincoln possibly brought up, or people brought up to Lincoln, Nicaragua. What are we talking about? But Henry Garnett was saying maybe we should leave. And the address he gives, the address to the slaves, I think it was Troy, New York, where they had the Negro Convention that year. The conventioners were voting on what political position to take. And Garnett gives this famous speech that becomes an address to the slaves. And I won't even quote all of it. I'll just give you one quick passage. Henry Garnett asked the question in his address, "Where is the blood of your fathers? Has it all run out of you?" He's like, "What's wrong with y'all? Are you gonna stay here? Are you gonna fight these people? Are you gonna leave?" They don't go so far as David Walker, who just said these people are devils, But Walker, in all fairness, is saying that as a Christian, because he says, go to the slave master, ask him if he's a Christian. If he says yes, ask him, is he going to let you go? If he says no, then understand that that is not a Christian, but in fact the devil, and you are authorized by God to end your oppression. But at any rate, so that's why he calls him the devil. A little different from Elijah Muhammad, but you get the point. Garnett is like, where's the blood of your fathers? You should leave. And the vote to adopt Garnett's address as the position of the convention fails by one vote, because Douglas is behind the scenes. Hey, man, we can't, bro. It's a little strong, brother. We can't really. So Douglas is politic and bend twisted arms. Don't let Garnett's speech be the thing. But they were friends. They had different political positions. Some of these stories I'm telling you all, oh man, there's another great story about Garnett that I won't take the time to shape right now. I would just encourage you to read the work of the great Alexander Crummell. If you read Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois has a chapter in there on Crummell. Du Bois writes about Crummell almost like he's a kind of father figure for him, of Alexander Crummell. Crummell speaks at Garnett's funeral because they were boys together. They went to school together in a place where the white boys tried to lynch them, and I'll let you all find out the story of how Garnett solved the problem. Garnett, Thomas Sidney, and Alexander Crummell stuck in a barn when the white boys circling the place going to try to kill them. But that's how far back they went. Henry Garnett, how did Africans, framing question 4, how did Africans conceive of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism? Henry Garnett ends up going to Liberia. Liberia, of course, is founded in 1847, in part to get rid of these free blacks, and in part because the free blacks wanted to get rid of America. And there's always been tensions in Liberia for that reason. Monroeville, Freetown, the red, white, and blue as their flag with that star in it and some stripes. Yes, it's set up. When the United States says they had never had any colonies in Africa, that's a bald-faced lie. One of them is Liberia, right next to Sierra Leone, which is where the British tried to solve the problem the same way. Go back to the history of Cinque and Armistad. I mean, you can watch a movie or you can read it. And parenthetically, if you watch that movie and you see Digimon Hansu get up and say, "Give us free," that was actually a little black girl in Ohio wrote that letter when they had sent some of them out there to get an education, and she had done that. But at any rate, Garnett ends up in Liberia. He becomes a chaplain, a minister. He's the first black person to pray on the floor of the United States Senate or House of Representatives. Henry Garnett ends up in Liberia because he says, there's something for us over here, and I think we need to think about Africa as the place to go. That's where he ends up passing away. His friend Alexander Crummell spends a couple of decades, almost 2 decades in Liberia, and then he comes back to the United States. And Crummell, of course, eventually founds the American Negro Academy right here in Washington, D.C. Howard students, we've talked about that and where that building is to this day. The speech that W.B. Du Bois gave for the American Negro Academy, the conservation of races, some of y'all know that speech. The church, the black church where he gave that speech still stands, but in the white hot heat and light in some ways of gentrification, that congregation is now considering divesting of that property. Not enough folks in the town. That's right off U Street. I'm just hoping it doesn't become a condo. Henry Garnett. There's John Brown, as I mentioned. Talked a little bit about John Brown a little earlier. To Purge This Land with Blood, Stephen Oates' book. There's a lot of stuff. In fact, W.E.B. Du Bois, of all the books he wrote, he is quoted as saying that his favorite book, the favorite of his books that he wrote, was the one he wrote on John Brown. Very interesting. He did it for a series. A publisher wanted to write about famous Americans, and he wrote John Brown. It was like, nah, bro, this is really not what we were talking about. So anyway, just to update a little bit, of course, there is Lottie Bunch, now the director of the Smithsonian Institution, the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And here's a good sister right here who came up through the ranks. I don't say up, because up sounds like it's a promotion that speaks to something substantive rather than a job title. She was and remains a librarian. Chicago folks know she was at the Carter G. Woodson Library, regional library there. Those of you from Baltimore know she was over the Enoch Pratt Library, Free Library of Baltimore. And from there, she came to work as the Librarian of Congress. And of course, they're celebrating because a little while back, they acquired this book. And this book had a lot of pictures in it of abolitionists and important people during this period in the early mid-19th century. And in the book, there was this. There was a photograph of Harriet Ross Tubman during the time she was helping black people and being a domestic terrorist, according to the United States. But at any rate, there's a name down at the bottom, Harriet Tubman. And actually, that's a blown up picture because when you see it, it's really a little small thing. It's in the museum. But they partnered on it. And so the Library of Congress has it, and they share ownership with the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. And this was actually from the day when they announced that they were going to put it on display at the Museum of African American History and Culture, which they did for a while. And it was always good to go in the museum and ask the guards where the stuff was, because read Ralph Ellison's little essay, The Little Man at Chiraw Station. And what you find is that the people who work in these museums, the people who work at the opera, the people who work at the libraries, the people who clean, the people who move boxes, people who are security guards, they often know as much or more about the stuff in there as the docents do. So it's very important to remember that. And Ralph Ellison reminds us of that in his essay, The Little Man at Chiraw Station. I always talk to the people who work in the building. Ellison's essay is actually in a book called Shadow and Act. If you want to get that book while y'all are being sequestered. All right, let's continue. There's Martin Delany again. This book right here. Wow, this is an issue. I just kind of snatched something to put up a copy of the book. There have been a number of editions, but this one has an introduction by the great Nigerian historian Toyin Falola. Got a chance to talk to Brother Falola a couple of years ago when he came to the Library of Congress to give a talk. Anything by Falola, Falola, incredibly productive publisher. He publishes a lot of stuff, writer. But this is an edition. Martin Delany's book, look at this title. The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, with an E, meaning get the hell out of America, and Destiny of the Colored Peoples of the United States. Official report of the Niger Valley Exploring Party. Remember I said Delany left America? He came back and on the eve of the Civil War, and this is actually his uniform because he was the first commissioned major. Well, he and W. Augusta, who was a surgeon. Talk about him another time. He and Douglas were friends. This is Robert Levine's book, Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, and the Politics of Representative Identity. Delany, in fact, Douglass is attested to have said, every day I get up and thank God he made me a man. Every day Delany gets up, he thanks God he made him a black man. How did Africans conceive of unity and thought beyond national boundaries? Douglass is really inward facing in terms of the United States. You know, the struggle is here. I'm black to the bone. We got to fight here. This is our home. He kind of puts Garnett on the periphery, as I said before. That's a little too radical for me. Although he himself is radical relative to people like, as you remember reading in Cedric Robinson's book, people like William Lloyd Garrison. You know, this whole moral kind of suasion. Let's talk to the hearts of the people of America. Douglas like, nah, man, we need fire. We need fire. Y'all go read that What to the Slave is the 4th of July speech. So Douglas is not by any means a retiring type. He's clearly militant. But Delany's thing is, yeah, we do need to fight and we could leave. So he's thinking beyond national boundaries before the Civil War. We see. It's very important. There he is, like a G in his full military dress. In fact, Levine has written another book since then. The name escapes me, but it's very interesting because one of the theories is that Lincoln commissioned Delany as one of the two highest-ranking blacks, early highest-ranking blacks, Major, like I said, Major Augusta, Major Delany. Major Augusta is actually buried in Marlington National Cemetery. You can go to his grave, not too far from the Confederate plot in Arlington, which is bizarre, but another story for another day. Delany, a lot of scholars are thinking that Lincoln gave Delany the active military appointment. And of course, Delaney's recruiting black soldiers. But Douglas is recruiting black soldiers too. Douglas doesn't get a military appointment. And part of the theory is that Lincoln, having met with Delaney, is convinced that Delaney is really going to help end this war, because Delaney would have killed Lincoln. I mean, let's be clear. I ain't going to say, well, who knows what he would have done. We'll let Delaney speak for itself. But the point is that Levine and others are saying maybe Lincoln extended that title and rank and appointment to Delaney because Delaney was like, look, get me some black soldiers and get some black officers and we'll end this war. I don't care about you, your mama, nobody else. I'm not going back to slavery. You understand? You got to read the history of Martin Delany, actually. He wrote it himself, and then many people have written about Delany, going back to Victor Ullman on Martin Delany. Actually, go back to a sister who wrote under a pseudonym, Frances Rollin, who wrote the life and public service of Martin Delany during Delany's lifetime. And, you know, there's a lot of Delany scholarships since then. And all you academics out there who may glance through this and still spelling Martin Delany's name with an E, don't blame that on your copy editor. Y'all know y'all just found out about Martin Delany. It's D-E-L-A-N-Y. It ain't no E in his name. All right, at any rate, Martin Delany sees black internationalism. So he's connecting the struggle of Africans in the United States to Africans around the world. And, you know, there's a real long backstory behind Delany and Douglas, but no time to go into it today. This, again, is Martin Delany's grave in Xenia, Ohio. He, his wife, Catherine, and several of their children, Cleopatra, Ramses, Toussaint, they named all their children after black heroes. And those black heroes I just named, Toussaint, for example, Haiti, Cleopatra, Egypt, Ramses, Egypt. Like, what are you doing? I mean, what about the black Americans? Look, man, we didn't come here as slaves. And of course, read Blake or the Huts of America, as I said. Let's let Delany speak for itself. This is during the debates these black abolitionists are saying. I shouldn't have said he would have killed Lincoln. Let's see what Delany would have done. Martin Delany, who by 1850 knew that white behavior was already subject to white superior status in society, responded to the Fugitive Slave Act, that's FSA, in an unprecedented manner of the times. In his response, Delany positioned his rhetoric in the language of the nation's time-honored principles, the right to protect one's family and home. Oh, that's some Second Amendment talk. Ida B. Wells is going to say something like this too later on. When he gathered before the crowd at Allegheny, Pennsylvania, because actually he was from Charlestown, West Virginia. Charleston, West Virginia. Charlestown, Charles is the brother of George Washington, that's what his name for. But his mother had to get him and his family, him and his siblings out of West Virginia because white folks found out they learned how to read. And so, you know, this is a problem. So they ended up being raised in Pennsylvania. It's a whole nother story. Delany went to Harvard Medical School, a lot of other stuff. Delany took the time to deride those who supported the entrapment. Okay, this is Martin Delany's words. Honorable Mayor, this is what I love. Douglas does this too. Fellow citizens, like they get you in, they pull you in, right? Yeah, okay, you in? Here I go. Honorable Mayor, whatever ideas of liberty I may have been received from reading the lives of your revolutionary fathers. They're good for this too. Richard Wright did the same thing in Congress. Yes, your people. Benjamin Banneker did this. If you read Black Movements in America, remember Banneker wrote them letters to Thomas Jefferson? Sir, may I recall to your mind, this is what they do. I may have been received from, any ideas I had came from your revolutionary fathers. And that's a lie, particularly if you read Blake. But he's, you know, buttering the guy up for the kill. I have therein learned that a man has a right to defend his castle with his life, even unto taking of life. Sir, my house is my castle. It's my castle. In that castle are none but my wife and my children, who are Africans to each other. Governance structure. Sir, my home, Maroonage, as free as the angels of heaven, and whose liberty is as sacred as the pillars of God. Look at it, man. Look at it. You can't disagree, right? If any man approaches that house in search of a slave, here comes the social structure. I care not who he may be, whether constable or sheriff, magistrate, or even judge of the Supreme Court. Now, he just murdering, he done got Tawny in it now. Maybe he wouldn't have killed Lincoln. I don't know. He didn't say president, so maybe no. Nay, let it be he who sanctioned this act to become a law, surrounded by his cabinet as his bodyguard. Oh, shit, he did talk about Lincoln. One more time. Missed that. If any man approaches the house in search of a slave, because ain't no slaves living here, bro. I care not who he may be. He gonna start at the local level, constable, sheriff. Then he gonna go a little higher, magistrate, or even judge of the Supreme Court. He said, no, you know what? Let me just get to the point. Let it be he who sanctioned this act to become a law, surrounded by his cabinet as his bodyguard. Actually, that wasn't Lincoln, previous president, 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. He said, with the Declaration of Independence waving above his head as his banner and the Constitution of his country, his country upon his breast as his shield. If he crosses the threshold of my door and I do not lay him a lifeless corpse at my feet, I hope the grave may refuse my body a resting place and righteous heaven, my spirit a home. Oh no, he cannot enter that house and we both live. You understand? That's Francis Rollins, under Frank Rollins, Sexism, Life and Service of Martin Delany. Read that book first before you read the rest of these people writing about that book. Martin Delany said, yeah, come on, bro. You looking for a slave? I got you. Yes, indeed. By 1861, of course, slave states, free states. We're not going to go over that. End of the war. Here go to Reconstruction districts. If those of you study Reconstruction know that they had 5 military districts. This is where the military is protecting black people. Black men are exercising the right to vote. Black people trying to acquire some property. The government established under Lincoln, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia. The one established under Johnson, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Texas. This is where the sellout occurs under Johnson. If you read again Catherine Frankie's book, Repair, which we actually did last fall for freshman seminar here at Howard, you know about the sellouts in Mississippi and South Carolina in terms of reneging on the land promise, 40 acres and a mule, as it's often gestured toward. Social Structure and Governance Structure. This is a new book. Ed Ayers wrote the foreword, but Christina Proenza Coles, American Founders, How People of African Descent Established Freedom in a New World. The reason I put this up as a slide is because when you talk about the social structure of America, it's often, I think it's in vogue now for people to talk about how black people contributed to the founding of America. That's very important. And it's also true. It's also a gloss that obscures the debates that were taking place inside communities of African descent about what our priorities should be. We just talked about Martin Delany. We just talked about Mary Ann Shadd Cary. We just talked about some of the black abolitionists like Henry Garnett and those who voted with their feet like Harriet Tubman, who John Brown wanted to come to Harper's Ferry. We didn't talk about everybody else, and there are many other people to talk about. Many of these black abolitionists, again, I encourage you all to look at the 5-volume Black Abolitionist Papers edited by Peter Ripley, I think University of North Carolina Press. But what Proenza Coles is talking about is how all these Africans, and if you can see these pictures, you will see how many of the other ones I'm not naming is actually Mary Ann Shadd up there in the top row. Phyllis Wheatley, of course, or Fatima, some people may think her name may have been in the governance structure. But American Founders reveals men and women of African descent as key protagonists in the story of American democracy. I won't go any further. They're key protagonists in the story of their lives. And at any given moment, it could be our country or your country. You just saw what Delany said. The whole point is that the struggle of African people, as Cedric Robinson keeps reminding us, is a struggle for self-determination, wherever they are in the world. And that's why the name of this book is Black Movements in America and not Black American Movements. And that's why when I first started teaching this course at Howard in the year 2000, I inherited a set of textbooks, and that was the first and last time I used a book by one of the great legends. Was able to shake the brother's hands a couple of times and talk to him briefly, the great John Hope Franklin. But the name of a book, when you call a book From Slavery to Freedom, you got a problem. Yes, the framework is commingling the social structure and the governance structure. You understand? Start your history with slavery, everything since then looks like progress, as John Henry Clark would say. And that's just the title, much less the internal logic. And y'all can learn about the internal logic another time. There's David Blight's book, Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory. This idea that the most important thing is the federal project. The most important thing is the American project. That may or may not be true depending on the situation that black people find themselves in. And of course, Derek Bell will talk about the principle of involuntary sacrifice. This is Derek Bell, one of his many books. It's a very important book, though, And We Are Not Saved, The Elusive Quest for Racial Justice. In Bell's opinion, in Bell's mind, racism is a permanent factor in this country. Demographics are changing. Who knows if that's going to remain true? But for his lifetime, it certainly was. Chapter 5, we talked about this already, some of it, so we're going to go very quickly. Here's Rayford Logan's book, The Negro in American Life and Thought, The Nadir, 1877 to 1901. This is actually an original copy. I took a picture of the original copy. This is, a distinguished historian writes the first account of a forgotten phase of American history. Dr. Rayford Whittingham Logan, professor of history, Howard University. He was considered one of Woodson's boys. I won't talk about that on this video. If you want to see that one, I've given a couple of talks on Carter Woodson over the years, and I talk about what that meant to be one of Carter Woodson's boys, one of the people that Woodson helped acquire these degrees and do this war work. Ruthius Ambush Taylor and Lorenzo Johnson Green and all these cats, man, very important. Rayford Whittingham Logan. He's a little bit older than the rest of these cats. This is very important. I'll go through this fairly quickly. The sections in Chapter 5 of Black Movements in America include Afro-Christianity and the Exodus, Black agrarians and populism. We've talked about some of this stuff in the previous lectures. For those of you who are not enrolled in the class, if you think, I'm moving around a lot, I am. It's like jazz. You got to be able to listen to that, but you can always pause this and go back to the other lectures and begin to piecemeal. This is where the study comes in. And you can do that as early as elementary school for some of you all. And so the Black agrarians and populism, the anti-lynching movement. I haven't talked about lynching yet. We'll mention it very quickly. The First World War, Black self-determination. Very important. These are the sections of Chapter 5 of Black Movements in America that will allow us to put in a kind of chronological order the context and then finish up with, on the United States side, what we've been talking about and lead us to the end of framing question 4, which will take us into the first quarter of the 20th century. So we'll continue that. So as we wind our way into the 20th century, let's walk across this bridge with these categories introduced by our brother Cedric Robinson in Chapter 5, the nadir, the dark point for Africans here in the United States, at least as mapped out by the ancestor Rayford Logan in his book, The Negro in American Life and Thought, the nadir 1877 to 1901. A subsequent edition would rephrase that, and the title would be rephrased as The Betrayal of the Negro, realizing that he's taking that from the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, the last of the federal troops, by Rutherford B. Hayes, who had been governor of Ohio and was a Republican, who actually in the election of 76 won the election because the Democratic Party conceded the states that were in contest. The votes hadn't all been counted. Y'all kind of know how that goes. And so the governor of New York, Samuel J. Tilden, conceded the election in exchange for some things in Map 83, Howard students. By November of 1876, after 4 years of war and 12 years of Reconstruction, the North began to tire of the defiant South. Terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the Regulators continued to thrive and torment blacks and pro-union whites despite the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. And I'll stop there. You all can read that for yourselves in your map books, Howard students. For those of you following along, this is from one of our texts, the Atlas of African American History and Politics, Armah Smallwood and Jeffrey Elliott. We just kind of use it to give us some visuals to go along with the text, that the various texts that we're reading. I'm mentioning it here now because these, typically in American history, the Compromise of 1876 or 1877, which is when Hayes took office, is seen as the end of Reconstruction, but this is a process that had been deteriorating for years prior to that, as the South struggled in the various states struggled against the federal government's attempts to exert control over them during Reconstruction, and understand that within the United States federal government there are conflicting tensions, the so-called radical Republicans, so forth and so on. I'll just mention this. By the election of 1876, the pre-Civil War Southern Democrats had regained control, this is my point, of Virginia, 1869. See that early part there? Tennessee, 1869, my home state. at least where I was born. North Carolina, 1870. Georgia, 1871. Texas, 1873. Arkansas, 1874. Alabama, 1874. Mississippi, 1876. So you see, by 1876, they had already begun to beat that back. And of course, even in the cultural meaning making of the South, the totems of the South, the flags of the South. People talk about the Confederate battle flag, but if you understand that that battle flag was adopted by the Confederacy in a way to distinguish the Confederate troops from the United States troops, because they both red, white, and blue, after some skirmishes in Northern Virginia in particular, the battle flag is adopted because it's easier to distinguish from the red, white, and blue of the Union Army. That is not the official state, the official national flag or state flag of the Confederate States of America. But if you look at the southern states, ironically, one of the states that has a state flag that doesn't riff on those red and white and blue color combinations is South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union. This flag is blue with a crescent moon on it and a palmetto. Those other states, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, they are variations, Georgia, of the Confederate flags. At any rate, they had already begun, the Democrats, these convicted white supremacists that we'll talk about more in framing question 5, had already begun to seize control, to exert control in those southern states, pushing against the Republican Party, which in the South was basically black people, a few carpetbaggers and some other folks, but they're basically black people. Again, read Lerone Bennett's Black Power USA, among many other books, and W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction in America. And really Du Bois, then Lerone Bennett, because Du Bois is the one who's pushing back against the Dunning School, against the way that American historians in the social structure had been writing about Reconstruction as a failure. And someone would just come out and say Negro domination, this kind of thing. But black scholars had been writing differently before that. So even before Du Bois, there are those writing about it. But I'm mentioning it now because Rayford Logan is now going to help Cedric Robinson and then help us build a bridge into the 20th century as we think about how people of African descent are thinking about unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism. So the United States during this period, 1877 to 1901, is also going to turn its attention beyond its national boundaries, beyond its state boundaries, and engage in its own attempts at imperialism, but pursuant to kind of like that Monroe Doctrine posture, meaning that everything in this hemisphere south of them, they consider to be in some ways their backyard. They're going to exert some control and see if they can pick up some cheap bargains at the turn of the 20th century, turn of the 19th into the 20th century. They're going to see if they can pick up some cheap territorial bargains in that period, in this same period. That's when you see them acquire, as I said in the previous lecture, some of the territories to become their empire of color. More about that maybe in a moment. And there are going to be those people in those regions that are going to resist. A couple people we'll talk about as we go forward between framing questions 4 and 5 in terms of African governance, who these Africans are to each other in these regions like the Spanish Caribbean, the French Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean, the Dutch Caribbean. Some of these Africans are going to come in contact with Africans on different islands and beyond the islands into North America and even into Africa. How did Africans, again, framing question 4, how did Africans begin to conceive of unity and thought beyond national boundaries? Pause here to reflect again. Martin Delany is in Lagos, is in Abeokuta in 1859, but who else is there? An African from Jamaica who has spent time in the United States, Robert Campbell. Another figure I haven't mentioned yet, but I'll mention him now just to put a marker down and continue. The great Edward Wilmot Blyden from the Danish West Indies, so to speak. St. Thomas, St. Croix, St. Vincent. He is a key Pan-Africanist. He ends up in what becomes Liberia. In fact, he is one of the people who is present for the creation of Liberia College, which of course now the University of Liberia, in Liberia, and he is venerated still in Liberia as a major intellectual. He's talking about Pan-Africanism. In fact, there's a new book that was published on Hilary Teague, a Liberian poet, well, actually a Caribbean poet who became famous in Liberia, a minister in government affairs there in Liberia, who's also a poet. And Edward Wilmot Blyden actually travels to the Nile Valley, to Egypt. And Blyden the son of the Danish Caribbean African minister who ends up in Liberia, who then travels across the African continent to Egypt, stands in the Great Pyramid. And you know, we go to Egypt every year. It looks like we won't be going this year, which is a tragedy because we love going to the Nile Valley. You know, we study Egyptian hieroglyphs and we teach it here at Howard. So to have students do real-time translations and connecting these intellectual work is very important. But you know, when we go to the so-called Great Pyramid, those pyramids on the Giza Plateau, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, you go in the chamber, and when you go in, you know, Edward Blyden said that when he went in, mind you, this is a room that has been visited by Africans many years. I mean, Paul Robeson and S.E. Robeson went in there, and Robeson started singing an aria in the Great Pyramid chamber. Louis Armstrong and Louise Armstrong outside the pyramid, and you see this famous picture of Louis Armstrong blowing his horn with the Sphinx and the pyramid in the background, and Louise looking at him. The pyramid has that effect. Edward Blyden went in the Great Pyramid. This is 19th century, late 19th century. And Edward Blyden says, while in that chamber, I thought to myself, you know, I thought of the words of the great poet in Liberia, Hilary Teague. Hilary Teague wrote a poem that said, from Pyramidal Hall, from Thebes, your ancestors call, retake your fame. And Edward Blyden from the Caribbean, living in Africa, traveled to the Nile Valley, said, while I was in there, if my voice could have reached every African in the world, I would have repeated the refrain from Hilary Teague's poem, retake your fame. I finally got a chance to read that poem for myself, read Teague's biography, some other things written by him. But the first time I heard that story was from Jacob Carruthers. And we were standing, talking, and he used to love to close some of his lectures with retake your fame. But that's what Blyden felt. This is Pan-Africanism. How do Africans conceive of unity and thought and action beyond national boundaries? And all of that is coming into play. And these Africans from different parts of the Western Hemisphere are coming in closer contact during this period of 1877 to 1901, because this is the period when American imperial aspirations exceed the boundaries they've established to kind of remain firm up to through the Civil War. And now they're going to push into the Caribbean. You know, Spain, France, Holland, the Dutch are going to recede a little bit. The United States is going to come in. That's when you get the United States Virgin Islands, these other things, Puerto Rico. We'll talk about Arturo Schomburg in a minute, because the Puerto Ricans don't want to be colonized by the Americans then or now. Of course, the South has been fully cemented as part of the U.S. national project. There's a book, actually, Louisiana State University Press came out maybe 40 years ago, Confederate Dreams of Empire or something to that effect. Maybe the specific title will come to me, but the Confederate States of America had a fantasy that they were going to run the CSA all the way down through Mexico into Latin America. They would have gone that direction too. In fact, Gerald Horne, another one of his many books, The Deepest South, he talks about how the United States and Brazil collaborated and how enslavement continued even after the Civil War. Another book that Gerald wrote, The White Pacific. You know, you ever ask yourself, how did enslavement continue in places like Hawaii, which of course becomes a state a century later after the Civil War, but it's actually being used by slave traders. You know, the Dole family involved in that. Dole pineapples. Ain't no pineapples in Kansas. This is Hawaii. You're talking about just criminal enterprise. And they're bringing enslavement or indentured servant labor mingled from other places. They call it blackbirding, kidnapping Africans who had been enslaved in the North American mainland, taking them as far as Hawaii. At any rate, all of these forces in the social structure, as kind of capitalism expands, looking for more markets, they've exceeded the limits of their ability to, the markets are saturated in Europe, America is expanding, looking for new markets, looking for more investment potential places to invest in for business. They're exceeding the state boundaries, but they're also involving Africans who are either labor forces or those who are even in the military, like the Spanish-American War, and they're seeing these things and they're becoming aware of each other as well during this period. So that's really the period we're talking about. Now, what Robinson is going to do in chapter 5 is, and Howard students, it's going to take you around page 96 in chapter 5. I just put this visual up so that, you know, if we were in that huge classroom we're usually in for this class, you could probably see these words. And it's not necessary for anybody on the recording to, because either you have the book, or I'm going to read this quote, or you're going to buy the book. Go to sankofa.com. You can get this book, Black Movements in America. And I would suggest it's a short book. It's only 180 pages, about 179 pages, and that includes the index. Quick reading, but, you know, read it slow, because he packs a lot in here. He says this. Cedar Robinson says, by the second half of the 19th century, so we're in that window, framing question 4, 2 alternative black political cultures had arisen, each nurtured by a particular black experience. He's talking about blacks in America now. Akin to the social divergences that appeared throughout slave societies in the New World, communities of free blacks gravitated toward the privileged political and social identities jealously reserved for non-blacks. At the same time, on the plantations and in the slave quarters, slaves tended to form a historical identity that presumed a higher moral standard than that which seemed to bind their masters. That is editorializing in there, but what he's basically tracing out, and kind of break this down a little bit and then keep going. You know, all societies, and Howard students, you know, we talked about this early on. We started talking about the levels of human social organization in framing question 2. All societies will develop class stratification, and a lot of it will reflect the material conditions out of which these societies emerge and kind of as they develop. And we know that, I mean, I don't hate to put labels on anybody, certainly not Cedric Robinson, but for purposes of this conversation, you know, if somebody referred to Robinson as a historical materialist, it would be entirely wrong. I mean, there's a spiritual dimension in there as well. But again, that third category, Howard students, you know, we do this, we repeat. Social structure, who are Africans to other people. Governance structure, who are Africans to each other. Ways of knowing, third category. What ways have Africans developed in tandem with others or independently and then commingling with others to make sense of and interpret their reality? Well, historical materialism is a way of knowing. Is, you know, some people might use it. I wouldn't, when we developed these categories, we didn't want to use terms that would be off-putting as points of entry. So we didn't want to have like epistemology, you know, because, you know, people get into fights, you know, words like Howard Thurman, the theologian, used to say, words are labels for concepts, for attempts to shrink reality down to manageable bites for humans to think through. So ways of knowing we thought was broad enough to encompass religion and science. So historical materialism, without getting into a long conversation about historical materialism, you're looking at how human beings interact with the material world and what social forces, what social structures rather, they develop out of that interaction. So what he's saying in this paragraph is that consistent with all societies, you see social classes begin to emerge that reflect different positions in a society, economic interests, cultural interests, however you want to put it. But he's saying that by the second half of the 19th century, there are 2 alternative black political cultures that have arisen, each nurtured by a particular black experience. So in some ways, it's almost like one of the most influential concepts in terms of an approach, a ways of knowing approach that have set the way that Africans who endured enslavement think about class relations in our society, American society particularly, is by that great thinker Malcolm X. When Malcolm talked about the house Negro and the field Negro, it's a brilliant metaphor. It also unfortunately flattened all the contradictions, because you got Negroes in the house who were revolutionary and Negroes in the field who were sellouts. But once you said house Negro, field Negro, it just put into place a framework that's difficult to has been difficult to displace. But in some ways, this is what Robinson is saying. He's saying those who he says, akin to the social divergences that appeared throughout slave societies in the New World. In other words, like the slave societies that emerged everywhere in the Western Hemisphere among African people who are forced into these social structures. Think about it. The farther you are away from whiteness, the more space you have to nurture and develop those ways of knowing, that movement and memory, that cultural meaning making, that will allow you to feed this marinage, this kind of distinction, this self-determination space. The closer you are to whiteness, this is where the house metaphor comes in. The closer you are to the house, so to speak, the more difficult it is to develop and nurture those ways of knowing, that meaning making, that kind of thing, so that you know, you want to be free too, but you're couching it in the terms that you are receiving because of your proximity to whiteness. The farther you're away from it, the easier it is to continue to nurture that stuff, right? So, akin to the social divergences that appeared throughout the slave societies in the New World, and this happened everywhere. That's why at this point, if we were in class, you know, I would ask students who were raised in the Caribbean, raised in Africa, to talk about class, because often people will say, well, it's not race in the Caribbean, it's class. No, race is there too, but because it's overwhelmingly black, the class distinctions are easier to tease out, or at least it's easier to identify immediately. Communities of free blacks gravitated toward the privileged political and social identities jealously reserved for non-blacks. So even black folks who are looking at unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries up to this point are couching it in terms of the language of the non-blacks they are close to around. Paul Cuffey, for example, who's saying we should go back to Africa. He's a shipbuilder, he's got money, he's in New England, and he's kind of thinking that way, right? Phyllis Wheatley is writing. She's in Boston. She's not free, but she's closer to whiteness in terms of her day-to-day interaction, so even her language is going to adopt asserting freedom in a certain way. So you see all this kind of stuff. At the same time, on the plantations and in the slave quarters, slaves tended to form a historical identity that presumed a higher moral standard than that which seemed to bind their masters. That's when you could argue that Robinson isn't as much of a historical materialist as people might say he should be, because he's talking about spirituality, morality in this case. But when you look at Vodun, when you look at voodoo or hoodoo, going back to Michael Gomez, exchanging our country mark, when you look at the ways of knowing that are developed beyond the grasp, the reach, or to use a phrase from cultural studies, the gaze of whiteness, you're going to see more deeply invested commitments that are coming out of these Africana ways of knowing. It's one reason, skipping forward for a moment to framing question 6, really, we talk about the Black Arts Movement in the United States. People ask the question, you know, how did we see the Black Arts Movement on the East Coast? We see it in, you know, Newark and Philly and Larry Neal, Mary Barack and them cats, you know. You see it in the Midwest, Hoyt Fuller and them, Black World, Negro Digest, you know, all the things that go in the Midwest. You see it on the West Coast, you know, you see Kwanzaa and everything coming out of the West Coast. So, I mean, all that stuff. When it gets to the South, even though you got stuff in New Orleans and other places, the question becomes, how does the Black Arts Movement look different in the South? Well, in the South, arguably, you've got Africans who are a little bit more beyond the white gaze. Not to say segregation didn't preserve it in other places, but it wasn't necessary to create these spaces from a distance. It's the same reason, for example, that you see in the South, there's an Africanity in terms of that idea of Africa that isn't necessarily articulated as African, but it's informed by Africa. That's why when hip-hop finally got to the South, them Negroes just took it over. Why? Because that beat is where it came from, particularly if you go to the deepest South, into the Caribbean. You know, that hip-hop, that cultural expression, like it always does, whether it be the blues or any other iteration, it's going to tap into those ways of knowing that exist beyond the gaze. For Robinson, the political implications of that are that that kind of proximity issue is going to affect the way we struggle, and it's when those two divergent streams converge, we make progress. But make no mistake about it, the larger of those two streams is the one that's deeper down in the class structure, the people who are farthest away. So he goes on and says, among the two formations in the United States, actually, let me go back to the last sentence. At the same time, on the plantations and in the slave quarters, slaves tended to form a historical identity that presumed a higher moral standard than that would seem to bind their masters. Let me see if I can use contemporary metaphor. You get a job, you're a manager, you at a retail chain outlet, or you're the manager of the store or whatever, and you're doing your job, and you got a proximity to, let's use a marker for whiteness, professionalism, you might call it, or a certain way of doing things. Then your cousins and them show up, and they, what's up, cuz? You gonna give me a hookup? What's going on? And these cousins have a little bit different position in the class structure. One you're familiar with, but you don't want them showing out, right? These turn-up Negroes. Think of the proximity, the turn-up Negroes got a different standard. Now, in their position, they thinking, why don't you hook me up? You act like your name is McDonald. Is your name Wendy? Is your name Macy? You Mr. Macy now? Come on, man, give me the hookup. Now, that might be considered to not be, appropriate behavior in this space. But the moral standard they're using is a different standard. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. What I'm saying is that there's going to be a different set of markers in terms of ways of knowing and interacting in community based on your proximity to whiteness in this social structure. And I'm flattening a lot of distinctions. At this point, we were in class, we talked more about this. In fact, I could cite a whole lot of books. We talk some more, we develop this, push this out, and tease it. In fact, Howard students will be doing this, I guess, Zoom. They got the Zoom license, so I'll be doing this as well. For everybody else, stay tuned. We'll have, when Sankofa continues in this, we're going to have all kind of conversations. In fact, I would encourage you to go, as you're going through the Sankofa YouTube site, there are already so many videos going back years here at Sankofa, and the archive is much more vast than that. And over the upcoming weeks and months, you're going to see a lot more stuff where these kind of things and related topics are going to be discussed in much, much, much greater detail. I would encourage you to look for that. Let's go to the next paragraph. Robinson says, among the two formations in the United States, the better publicized was the assimilationist black political culture that appropriated the values and objectives of the dominant American creed. That's for sure. That's every black history book there is. It's really told as a story to black elites or black elite discourse. That's why you're going to write the 500,000th book on W.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk, which is great. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. Because there are 5 million books on Lincoln. Maybe not 5 million, but you get my point. But it's going to be based on the interpretation of black life is going to be read through the elites, as is the privileging of intellectual work among that group. Those at Howard, if you've taken the Black Aesthetics course, we spend months talking about these things, but we obviously not doing it here. Especially among, back to Robinson, especially among the urban free blacks of the colonial and antebellum periods before the Civil War, a liberal bourgeois consciousness was nourished, packed with capitalist ambitions and individualist intuitions. Yes, these are the first Negro types. Some of y'all watching this probably the first Negro type. I'm the first Negro on this job. You're the first Negro to have this elected position. Yeah, them first Negroes, that's an individualist aspiration that gets read as collective progress. Those two things don't necessarily commingle. And just because one person got on, that don't mean everybody else is getting on. That's your cousin and them showing up like, what's up, cuz? What you doing? In other words, if you got there just for yourself, we might get loud in here and then you lose your job. Or if you got on for us, then I know how to regulate this, but I have no evidence until you act in a certain way that you're here with us. Conversely, when that person runs into trouble in these spaces, now that's when you go and try to get your cousins. Think about that. I mean, there are some stories I could share about some Negroes that probably everybody knows, but I'm not even going to get into that. I'm just going to say, you know who you are. But the point is that there are moments when black folk get in trouble in these spaces that then the call goes out for the race to surround her or him. Yeah, that's what Robinson is saying takes place, not in that instance, in that kind of metaphor, but in the instance of black political struggle. Because again, as Stokely Carmichael, the great Kwame Ture used to say, if you put Martin Luther King in Montgomery by himself or Birmingham by himself, he would be killed. No, it's those people who stayed off the bus in Montgomery. It's those people who faced the fire hose in Montgomery that put the black elite in a position to negotiate for everybody. It's a symbiotic relationship. Rather than me gloss it, let's let Robinson finish his thought. Chapter 5, page 96. He says, a constant before and after the Civil War and into the new century, this consciousness manifested itself in a tendency toward an Americanist optimism about integration/assimilation. This is the blacks who are closer to whiteness, the assimilationists. When assimilation seemed ill-conceived, the quiescent black middle stratum of wage laborers and professionals hunkered down, and a minority and renegade species of black nationalist desires was enjoined. My old professor at Tennessee State, the great Bobby Lovett, Dr. Lovett from Arkansas, who's written the most comprehensive single-volume history of historically black colleges and universities, might chuckle at that, because that's damn near the story of every HBCU there is. Look, if they're going to lock us out, let's at least make a parallel community that's going to have these aspirations in black. Now, do you want to do it for the race? Absolutely. But what you mean by for the race gets very complicated. Read Jim Anderson's book, The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935. Read all of the scholarship on Booker Washington and these fights that are going back and forth. In fact, Adolph Reed's famous essay from the Village Voice, what are the drums saying, Booker? The Curious Rise of the Black Public Intellectual, republished in a book of his essays called Class Notes. Very, very important. Understand that this is the strata who are saying we're going to be black nationalists because we've been locked out, and we are going to kind of replicate the values that we've inherited from this proximity to whiteness. He goes on. He says, but within this galaxy of liberalism, regardless of variant, a special affection for Republican values predominated, grounded on a presumption that leadership was reserved for an elite defined by nature and excellence. It's a minefield we walking in, Howard students. At this point, we'd have a long conversation on this paragraph, but I'm going to keep going. You see where this is going, right? It was, to other Americans, the more easily understood of the two political cultures, because it flowed from the political and social intercourse between these free black elite and American society in general. That's as true now as it was when Robinson is referring to this late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, the talented 10th, the new Negro, this kind of thing. In fact, some of the contradictions in this and some of the tortured ways of trying to think through Africanness in a way that allows you to tap into this larger base of Africana ways of knowing, and at the same time straddle this fence with these kind of aspirations that he's talking about. I don't know if there's a better life to use if you're going to pick one person as a prism through which to kind of read some of this stuff than Alain Leroy Locke. Look at my friend Jeffrey Stewart's book on Alain Locke, The New Negro, which won the National Book Award. Jeff Stewart was actually here just when he got shortlisted for that award, and he spent the day with us here at Howard because he used to work at Moreland Spingarn Research Center here. Fine scholar, brilliant scholar, great brother. And that book is a compendium of how these forces kind of emerge over this period we're talking about in Frame of Question 4, particularly through the life of Alain Locke. Shout out to Philadelphia, my adopted hometown, where Alain Locke, of course, that's where he's from. His father, who went to Howard Law School, which should tell you something about how far that elite goes back. Moreover, Robinson says, since bourgeois black culture mirrored dominant political beliefs, it had the advantage of an economy of expression. Yeah, you might explain yourself if you're couching this language in the notions of American exceptionalism and aspirational logic. That's why even in the 1619 Project, when you commingle black aspirations with our country, our nation, the perfectibility of the American experiment, which kind of in some ways turns away from those other elements. As I said, you really don't want to push too deep with black people, certainly not Native Americans either, or a lot of people who immigrate to this country because the dollar is strong. You don't want to push too hard into that governance structure conversation they have when they don't think anybody's looking about what they really think about America. You may find it may be shocked, some of y'all might be shocked. So he goes on and says, taking American material values and national ambitions for granted, liberal black political culture could resonate with the ongoing public articulations of the American majority. Given this license, it was possible to subsequently create the illusion and self-serving conceit that such values and interests represented blacks en masse. The idea is that because we think this, all black people think this. No, bro, that's not true. Framing question 4, how do Africans begin to conceive of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism? There's a reason the Garvey movement is able to penetrate the United States so effectively. These Africans have no deep allegiance to this flag or to this national project or this experiment. It's a situational logic. Do you love America? I sure do. It's like surviving an encounter with the police. Do you love the police? I sure do. What's your objective? I'm trying to walk out of this without having to either harm you or be harmed. But if you ask me after I'm here, that's when you find out what I really think about America or the police, which in some ways are the same thing. But the point is that Pan-Africanism, for many of these Africans who would never go to Africa, in fact, Garvey never set foot on the continent of Africa. It's not about a return to a material continent, but it is about attempting to negotiate for an improved quality of life that you want all people to have, beginning with your people, because you've been denied it. And that aspiration does not come with a flag, does not come with an anthem, does not come with a connection to George Washington or Alexander Hamilton or Abraham Lincoln. It comes with an aspiration that's coming out of a way of knowing that says there's a certain moral standard that I hold that I hold in my little town or my little church or my little mosque or wherever I'm doing, whether it be Noble Drew Ali or Henry Neal Turner or Henry Neal Turner's friend, who was Martin Luther King's grandfather, Willis Williams, all those cats, E.D. Wicks Williams, I'll talk about E.D. Nixon in a minute, A.D. Williams, who is actually the grandfather of Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King's mother's father, is friends with Henry McNeil Turner in the Georgia Equal Rights League. Now, they are proud Americans, but that proud Americanism is not based in a faith in the Constitution and the Declaration in the way we would read it necessarily. It's based in something else. It's based in a commitment that transcends national boundaries. Because in a minute, we'll see Henry McNeil Turner is a Pan-Africanist. At some point, McNeil Turner is like, yeah, some of us can lead this country. And the AME church that he becomes the bishop of establishes churches in South Africa, perceiving unity in thought, conceiving of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries. Even as that's the same Henry Turner who said God himself wouldn't pass judgment on my manhood. Even as that's the same Henry Turner who confronts the white theologians in the pages of the AME Church Review, which if you read the AME Church Review, you can see a lot of this Pan-Africanist conversation going on. Not just Henry Turner, Bishop J.T. Holly, who goes to Haiti, Orisha Tuka Faduma, who comes out of West Africa. There's great books on him. They're coming up in the AME Church. The AME Church becomes a global enterprise. And what is it? The African Methodist Episcopal Church. Remember, Richard Allen and them, these cats are talking about Africa way back in, well, I'll say way back, relatively speaking, in the 18th century, 1780s, 1790s, 1787, the Free African Society. So the AME Church provides a home for some of this Pan-Africanist talk, and Turner can at once be a Pan-Africanist and someone running for the Georgia State Legislature and a theologian who argues in the pages of the AME Church Review, I think it was 1898, he writes an essay and said, God is a Negro. That's a way of knowing. What does that mean? Henry Turner says God is not human. God is no color. God is the air, the grass, the water, all that. But if you must, you buckaroo, if you must make God a human being, then I say God is a Negro. How foolish would it be for me to make God look like you? Yeah. Shout out to everybody who understands that. And everybody else, you're probably not watching this anyway, so we're just talking to the people watching this and the people who have to, Howard students. So which means we continue to page 97. To the contrary, now Robinson's talked about the black elite. Now he's going to the black masses because he's saying that black elite are going to kind of argue that they're speaking for everybody and they're speaking in a language that beyond black communities in the social structure, they don't need to translate because the language of freedom struggles is couched in a way that in the American context, people kind of understand it. By people, I mean non-blacks. Really, I mean whites. White elites, really. Let's go to the masses of blacks, so to speak. To the contrary, Robinson writes, the black mass movements of the late 19th and 20th centuries proved both the existence and vitality of an alternative black political culture. He says this political culture is emergent from the brutal rural regimes of slavery and later peonage. This is the stuff that Sterling Stuckey was writing about in his book Slave Culture, that Mike Gomez is tapping into in Exchanging Our Country Marks, that the generation before them are writing about in many ways. Another name that might evoke, since we're talking about a Howard University class, the great Sterling Brown, the strong men who keep coming. Ma Rainey, how Ma Rainey evokes this. In fact, we're going to see Ma Rainey again, probably about 20 minutes. Ma Rainey, his poem Ma Rainey. These are the Negroes that Sterling Brown is talking about when he takes a Mary Baraka and A.B. Spellman and Tim Jenkins and them cats over to his house here in D.C. and is playing the blues for them. These are the black folks that E. Franklin Frazier would say are not represented by the black bourgeoisie, which he writes in 1957, published first in France, here in the United States. Another Howard University professor. The people, the running joke was that E. Franklin Frazier wrote Black Bourgeoisie about black people, the bourgeois Negroes, and his wife and her friends, which was kind of a joke. I said I never met E. Franklin Frazier, but Joyce Ladner, the junior professor who came to Howard as a junior professor, who was one of the kind of extended disciples of Franklin Frazier, who kind of tutored her, jegnered her when she first came to Howard. She said she actually published E. Franklin Frazier's The Failure of the Negro Intellectual in her book, The Death of White Sociology, published in 1973 when she was a junior professor here at Howard. And she asked permission from Franklin Frazier's widow to publish that because he had passed away a few years before, and she did publish it. I should mention that essay because Franklin Frazier, near the end of his life, recognizes and writes in that essay that preoccupation with race and the American race problem in some ways blinded Black American intellectuals to the larger global questions of humanity. And he said, I recognized that when I traveled and I saw Black people in other places talking about these larger questions, and it seemed like the Black Americans were talking about the race problem. That kind of echoes the last editorial that Carter Woodson wrote just before he died in 1950 when he said, Negro History Week got people talking about the race question. We should not be doing that. That shows me that we have failed to understand the meaning of that week, which is a short period of time to talk about what we've learned about Black people the entire year. But when Joyce Ladner gets permission to do that, she puts that essay by Franklin Frazier as the essay that I think opens up the death of white sociology, if my memory serves me correctly. But I remember asking Dr. Ladner, I said, Dr. Ladner, is it true that the joke was that Franklin Frazier wrote Black Bourgeoisie about his wife and her friends? And she smiled and said, yeah, that's what they say. So I'll take it from her, having not been able to talk to either of the Fraziers. But, and you should read about E. Franklin Frazier. In fact, there's a book called E. Franklin Frazier Reconsidered that kind of walks through his life, a fascinating figure. But the reason I bring him up is because that Black elite that Robinson is talking about here, that he contrasts with the Black masses, are saying that they are representing the Black masses. And what Robinson is saying here is that no, this other Black political culture emerges from the brutal regimes of slavery, the rural regimes, and later peonage. And here's the sentence that he's saying he's using to describe this Black mass, this culture that is this kind of mass culture that comes out of this brutality moment. He says, inventive rather than imitative, communitarian rather than individualistic, democratic rather than Republican, Afro-Christian rather than secular and materialist. The social values of these largely agrarian people generated a political culture that distinguished between the inferior world of the political and the transcendent universe of moral goods. So these are the Negroes who really ain't going by the rules. You understand? We know that echo. We see the echo in the culture. It's no accident that the culture that shifts this American culture and modern world culture, that is the pieces of that are contributed by African people, aren't really contributed by the Black elites. They are contributed by those who are deeper down in the class structure, who are generating it out of this stuff. Inventive rather than imitative. Think about Black culture in terms of cultural meaning making and movement and memory, right? Communitarian rather than individualistic. Think of the civil rights movement. Everybody gonna vote. Why? Because in church, everybody gotta sing. Everybody gotta come. Everybody, as they say. We all coming, and ain't nobody coming. I'll tear it up. This kind of thing. You see that emergence. He says separatism was the principal impulse of this culture. And over the next century or more, this separatism would assume several forms already familiar. Marronage, he says. Immigration with an E. We could leave this country or leave this state of Mississippi, but we ain't gonna stay here. Migration, as he says, this migration. And domestic or external colonization. The all Black towns, Black Wall Street, the Black part of town that you turn into the place you want to have. Although it foreclosed the possibility of integration or assimilation, separatism in its most sanguine manifestations, in other words, its less confrontational manifestations, accommodated the possibility of social coexistence, avoiding the moral squalor of Black racism. But in times of acute oppression, the impulse could assume the forms of xenophobia, including the most virulent forms of race hatred rising from both real and imagined experiences. Now see, we're not talking about something that's perfect. So there are going to be moments when you have I guess Mike Wallace may have called it by the 50s when he's spying on the Nation of Islam with his cameras, the hate that hate produced. There's going to be this kind of response to whiteness, this kind of hate back at you response. But Robinson is also saying that's just part of a continuum of separatist impulses. We want to have something we control. And when you see Africans talking about, connecting themselves beyond national boundaries, the connection is based on this sense of a Blackness that they want to control. Fela Kuti coming out of Nigeria, going to England and saying, I was sounded like white people and this kind of thing. And then he gets in contact with some of these Africans from the United States and some of these sisters, one in particular, and he says, damn, she was looking at me like, why are you talking like white people know this about Africa? I had to leave Africa to find Africa. Very important to understand. Bob Marley coming into contact with that early black rock and roll, black, R&B, Isley Brothers and stuff. He comes to Wilmington, Delaware, spends some time in Wilmington, Delaware. Why? The migration pattern. His mom gets a job, gets work up here. And so he gets infused with this, but he's also connecting it to what's going on backyard in Kingston, in Jamaica, in Trenchtown. And these things commingle into a culture that's rooted in Africa and then exported throughout the world beyond national boundaries. Let's continue. That's what Robinson has set the terms in chapter 5. So let's kind of wind toward the end of our conversation for framing question 4 with some of these examples of black resistance that are taking place during this period. So from the mid to late 19th century into the first quarter of the 20th century. Since we talked about Bob Marley, maybe we'll look, that's Paul Bogle. Who's Paul Bogle? Paul Bogle is one of the Africans who resisted in Jamaica as the English tried to tighten up on them. And unlike America, you got black people on the money in some of these countries because you got, and we'll talk about this in framing question 5 when we get into Ron Walter's work, Howard students, and we talk about his 5 types of Pan-Africanism. One is the relationship between states that African people control, Jamaica being one. You can put your money, you can put Paul Bogle on your $2 notes. There's Nanny, of course, Nanny of the Maroons. I'm just using the money as an example because black folks in America don't have any money with black people's faces on them. And some people, like my former student, now professor at Bowie State University, one of the most brilliant young intellectuals of her generation, Shanice Thompson, has written about this in terms of Harriet Tubman. Do you want Harriet Tubman on the money? Do you not want her on the money? There's a whole debate about that because the money represents the social structure, but from the governance structure, there is an idea that we want to have something that represents us. But just think of the irony of the fact that you're going to put Harriet Tubman on money that when she was alive, there was a price on her head. I mean, it's all kind of contradictions in that. But at least in Jamaica, you can put Nanny from Maroon Town, Queen of the Maroons, on the money. My man Roy Anderson did a whole documentary on Nanny. Look up Roy. Roy's a very important filmmaker. And of course, the Maroons of Suriname. We talked about that in the previous lecture. S. Allen Counter, I Sought My Brother. Very important. I mean, man, this hat ain't come from Africa, but that swag did, so he can make that hat look good, because that hat was never intended to look that good on the brother. And the sister right here, she looking like, yeah, we know who we are. That look on her face, Yoruba would call that itutu, coolness. You don't smile in every picture. Come on, go take a picture. Are you ready? That's right. See, that survived in terms of ways of knowing, culture meaning making, that survived in Africa. Now, you may find Negroes deeper down in the social structure, the class structure. They will be perhaps, I won't say more African, but they certainly will have an African ways of knowing that are informed by a longer arc. Put it that way, because I'm not into that who's black and who's not black. Politically maybe, but it's for another day. All right. Oh, no, we're not going to do that. That's for another framing question. Let's go over to let's kind of wind this up. So, of course, you have this whole region. Of course, when we talk about Africans conceptualizing unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries, we can look at so-called Central America, the Yucatan Peninsula, the top part of Latin America, going all the way down to Brazil if we wanted to. And of course, the Windward and Leeward Islands of the Caribbean, the French Caribbean, Dutch Caribbean, Spanish Caribbean. You see, very importantly, we could name Pan-Africanists from all of these regions who conceptualize unity in thought and action. We talked a little bit about some of them, of course. We talked about, from this region, Edward Wilmot Blyden, which we talked about a little bit. Puerto Rico, Arturo Schomburg, who's, as a young man, teenager, involved in the Puerto Rican liberation movement, independence movement, self-determination movement, who ends up in New York City, and because he is invested in learning the history of African people worldwide and helping others do it, amasses the largest collection, still the largest collection, because it's continued, of course, long after his death, I think 1938. He spent a couple years at Fisk, then went back to New York. The Schomburg collection in New York, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. Best book on him, first book on him, written by the recently deceased, recently transcended former librarian at the Moreland Spingarn collection, Sister Eleanor DeVerney Sinnett. Her husband Calvin, still alive, medical doctor. They knew Malcolm X, spent time in West Africa. The Sinnetts. Eleanor wrote the book on Schomburg. There's been a more recent book, Diasporic Blackness, by a good sister at Hunter College in New York, Vanessa Valdez, who's done some very important work. But Schomburg is a key figure in this, because Schomburg is one of those Negroes from the field, so to speak. And he's brought into this discourse. So if you read Alfred Moss's book on the American Negro Academy, you see there's real tension there. Because Schomburg is allowed into the American Negro Academy, these kind of black elites who are aspiring to this kind of connection of Africa to America and thinking through these ideas. Paul Dunbar was a member. In fact, it's argued that Paul Dunbar wanted to name the American Negro Academy the African Academy. But those elites, I like Negro. Yeah, I know you like me. Y'all gonna make Negroes stand up. You ain't ready for Africa. Even though your ancestors were, like Richard Allen and them. Du Bois was in it, a young man at the time. 1897 is when it is founded. Alexander Crummell, who passed away the following year, is the founder. Remember, Crummell spent them 20 years almost in Liberia, Henry Garnett's friend. They found it here in Washington, D.C. The church is still here. They then go to the Congregational Church where they deliver the lectures. But what is the first lecture of the American Negro Academy in 1897? Alexander Crummell from New York. Alexander Crummell, who is a Pan-Africanist of sorts, but Alexander Crummell gives the speech. The name of the speech is Civilization, the Basic Needs of the Race. What? Yeah, it's crazy. But he's Pan-Africanist, brilliant dude, but he's got this kind of torturous relationship with his proximity to whiteness. In fact, to this day, one of the great books on Alexander Crummell, I remember first time I read it, I was like, wow, the title gripped me. This was many, many years ago. The great Wilson Jeremiah Moses wrote a book on Alexander Crummell. There's a book before that, Gregory Risby, actually, who was a professor of English here at Howard and helped found the African American Studies Department here at Howard in '69. But the book by Wilson Moses, Alexander Crummell, A Study of Civilization and Discontent. It's a difficult thing. Crummell went to Cambridge, all kind of stuff. I don't get into John C. Calhoun and some of that stuff. But yes, you see then Henry Garnett, all these cats, Alexander Crummell from up here, North America, but they link with people like Edward Blyden from here, Arturo Schomburg from here. Schomburg's in the American Negro Academy, but you see Elaine Locke and them critiquing him in part because they say, Locke is writing letters back and forth. So yeah, Schomburg's English isn't that great. I'm thinking, the guy speaks 2 languages. So how's your Spanish, Elaine? But anyway, I'm not going to get into that because obviously, many people who worked at Howard, to that bourgeois point, would look at the fact that I'm at Howard and be like, what the hell? Did we lower the standards? And I'm like, no, maybe you raised them. But at any rate, you got Haiti, Dominican Republic, you got Africans here. Antenor Furman, for example, from Haiti. If you haven't heard of Antenor Furman, very important. He writes a book called The Equality of the Races. He's like the Sheikh Anta Diop of the late 19th century. Very important. He's going across science and the arts. Brilliant piece talking about African people. But he's coming out of Haiti, so they've been doing that since Prince Sanders and the Haitian papers. They've been doing that since P.V. Vastey. If you don't know that name, P.V. Vastey, V-A-S-T-E-Y, has been writing about this. Very important. Right at the time of the Revolution. For a century, they've been doing this. By the time you get to Furman in the 1890s. And we could go for us, of course, Jamaica, Marcus Garvey, of course. Cuba, we talked about Cuba a little bit, but we haven't talked about the intellectuals of Cuba. We'll really do that in framing question 5. At the same time this is going on, late 19th century, America is expanding its empire of color, which means America is going to scoop up some of these Africans. The reason that Schomburg ends up in New York is the reason a lot of Africans from this region end up in the mainland in places like New York. They end up there because they're being pulled in by social structure, pull factors, employment, the increasingly close imperial relationship between America and some of these Caribbean countries. But while that's going on, Europe has turned its attention, the back end of framing question 4, to Africa and other places in the world. These represent kind of pre-European assault governance formations and social structure, as we talked about before, in Africa. Now, you got some place like Algeria, which is close to southern France. Algeria been something France has been trying to get since 1830. But by the time you get to the Algerian War, 1954, the War of Independence, France said, no, we're going to pull up alongside that in framing question 5. But there have been some Europeans trying to get into Africa in terms of taking parts of Africa for several reasons. They've saturated, I'm just going to use the pointer to go up here for Europe. They have saturated European markets, so they're looking for new markets. They're also looking for new investment opportunities. They want to go somewhere and they want to just take the stuff out of Africa. Right? As John Henrik Clarke used to say, everybody wants out of Africa, everything out of Africa, and they don't want to pay for it. The British have been down here. Now the British are coming down here. They want Southern Africa. Now, of course, they're going to run into other white people who would come down before them, Dutch, going back to the VOD or as the Dutch East India Company. Many times we've been to Cape Town with Howard students. We go to the University of Cape Town. We stay at the University of Cape Town. And Cecil Rhodes, whose statue I would spit on every morning as I was walking down Rondebosch Road to get the papers, I can't do it no more. Why? Because you South Africans said Rhodes must fall. And he's gone. But at any rate, and now everything must fall. In fact, fallism is the move. We'll talk about fallism in framing question 6. But he's British. The British come after the Dutch, the Boers, the farmers. The Dutch down there are like the Americans in the United States. You know, he's the pioneers. They got their own pilgrim story, the Voortrekker, the Orange Free State, and all that. So they've been beefing since the early 19th century. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the late 19th century now. The British are in West Africa. There's a statue of Yasantewa. Yasantewa is a queen mother. Ajiso, I think, was the place she was queen mother of. But, you know, the Ashanti got this formation where you can be a paramount chief or a queen mother in a different region, and then you form together when you come under the umbrella of the Ashanti nation. That's Kumasi is the capital for that, the Asantehene. The queen mothers pick the Asante. Let's pick the ruler. So, you see the man out front, but what you don't see is the women necessarily who have picked him, right? And when they take Prempeh, who is the chief, the Asantehene, she steps up and says, we got to go to war with these British. The Yasantewa War, 1901. They had fought more than a half dozen wars against the British because they're not going to be colonized. And the British governor came in and asked for the sikidwa, the so-called golden stool. Y'all seen those, what they call stools? I call them thrones because the Queen of England, if she sits on a stool, then that's a stool. If she sits on a throne, then that's a throne. But Yasantewa fights the war. It's a great story behind that, but I won't get into it now. You can read Adu Boahen. Got a chance to meet Adu Boahen before he passed away. Adu Boahen wrote a book on the Yasantewa War. But they're fighting. This is imperialism. This is going on at the same time the Africans in the United States are fighting what emerges as Jim Crow in that last quarter of the 20th century, the 19th century. And it's going on as in the Caribbean, they have moved from enslavement to this form of kind of apprenticeship, and they are engaged in their own liberation struggles. This is Yasantewa coming up on 1900. Samori Touré, West Africa, French West Africa. He's fighting. He's the grandfather of Sekou Touré, who becomes the first prime minister of independent Guinea. Very important to understand. Just putting these up by the by for y'all students. East Africa, Nile Valley. Read David Levering Lewis's book, The Race to Fashoda. You got the British trying to beef it out. You got the Italians trying to attack the Horn of Africa, what becomes around here, Abyssinia, right? That we know, Ethiopia, Eritrea. You got the Italians in that region. In fact, I'm sitting in the place where, Haile Geriman's putting the finishes touches on his next conversation film on the Italo-Ethiopian War. If you've never seen his film, Adwa, very important to understand, 1896, the same year of Plessy versus Ferguson in the United States, the Ethiopians come together and put the Italians out, whip their ass, and like, we see you later. And then they come back for the rematch and get beat up again. Why? You're not going to colonize us. It's not going to happen. And guess what? There are newspapers now. There are telegraphs now. There are newsreels now. So now you got Negroes in the Caribbean and in the United States saying, we want to sign up and fight for Abyssinia. What are you talking about? How do Africans conceive of unity and thought beyond national boundaries? Because you would let people fight over there for their people who are Italian or their people who are Spanish. I want to fight for the Ethiopians. Are you an Ethiopian? Yes. You're not from Ethiopia? I read the Bible. It says in Psalms that Ethiopia shall stretch forth its hands unto God and princes shall come out of Egypt. Well, that don't make you no Ethiopian. Yes, but Ethiopian mean Africa and I'm African. You African? Yeah, I'm black and they black. What are you talking about? Let's go back again to Richard Allen and them. They're using that. They're using that Bible verse to say they too are Africans. David Walker is using it. Richard Allen is using it. J.T. Holly and Herman Neal Turner are using it. They name it the African Episcopal Church. They name it Abyssinian Baptist Church. They are connected to Ethiopia. So when they have this resistance movement, now you go a little bit further into the Sudan, you got this dude. He's a Muslim. He's, Arabic. Who is he? He's the Mahdi. The Mahdi is like, we fighting against the British too. Now, as John Henry Clark would say in some stories, it ain't no good guys. But here's the point. Whether you like them or don't like them, what you know is you don't like the people they're fighting against. So situational logic makes them your hero. So the Mahdi becomes a hero to some people. I'm going to put the British out of the Nile Valley, the upper Nile Valley, because the Nile runs this way from here down to here. You understand? Shaka, of course, who predates the people we're talking about now. Shaka's in southern Africa. The Zulu, sometimes it's brutal when you putting people together. Some of the work may be indefensible. That's where you read Kwei Armah's The Eloquence of the Scribes. He's got, Howard students, y'all remember this. You remember this because we read this. He's got a couple of chapters on this. Chapter 10, Thomas Mofolo, who writes the Epic of Shaka. From oral, he puts it on print, and now you can read out of a book. But this is a story of how they unify Shaka, his mother Nandi, all them unifying what becomes the Zulu nation against the British in this case. And sometimes they beef. There's a book called Frontiers that talks about some of this. Other Africans who they say are not fighting hard enough, like the Xhosa people. Xhosa people are the people out of which Nelson Mandela comes, and out of which Thabo Mbeki comes. In fact, contemporary politics, they call, well, I'm not going to get into that, ANC stuff and economic freedom fighters. We talk about that frame of question 6. But the point is that the Zulu see themselves in South Africa in some ways the same way the Ashantis see themselves in West Africa. Because for the Ashantis, they would say, we fought the British. Now about you Fanti and you Ga people, y'all was kind of soft on it. I mean, is it a fair critique? You got to be close enough to it to understand what's going on. But the thing they're saying is we resisted. And that's no accident that there are women around the African world named Ya Asantewaa. Like my niece, my blood niece, my oldest niece, my brother's daughter, Ya Asantewaa. Her name is Jumoke Ya Asantewaa because she named for Ya Asantewaa. How many Shakas we got walking around? You understand? Because these are not Africans who were born on the continent of Africa, but they are gestures, movement and memory. They are gestures toward this notion of black solidarity. So these are just some representative figures. And of course, Nzinga, who predates all of them. Nzinga is in Angola. Some very good work on Nzinga. In fact, Linda Haywood, who used to be on the faculty here at Howard, who's now in Boston, Linda Haywood has written a magnificent book called Nzinga of Angola, where she talks about Nzinga in the 17th century negotiating with the Portuguese, saying if you are enslaved, if you get to my boundaries, you're free. Very important. So let's kind of get into winding up. Of course, you got urban areas in Africa. I just give y'all a glimpse of this. Europeans come, oh, they got cities. Yeah, they got cities. What's the name? Vitterich. She's got a Coquette Vitterich. It's a hyphenated name. Writes about cities in Africa, in urban Africa. Years ago, a brother who helped us write the curriculum in Philadelphia, Daoud Malik Watts, wrote about the black cities of Africa. A lot of urban formations in Africa. I mean, it's not when the Europeans get there. That's Benin, by the way. But just another iteration. 1886, by then they've met in Berlin and said we're going to carve up Africa. So just another, Howard students, you all know we've covered all this and there's maps on this. Now you see so-called colonial rule. This is now Belgian possessions like the so-called Belgian Congo. Stop making movies like Tarzan, please. They tried to make a Tarzan movie over 4 or 5 years ago. And here's the ugly thing about it. The latest Tarzan movie, they tried to sneak in George Washington Williams. Read John Hope Franklin's book on George Washington Williams, the historian. But they made him into this kind of anti-colonialism / action hero figure, and Samuel L. Jackson played him. I mean, he played it with some dignity, but again, it was a Tarzan movie. Why you keep making Tarzan? Because you got to continue to reiterate this notion that somehow exceptional whiteness trumps everything else around it. Stop making them Tarzan movies, or keep making them, make them all. Because I saw that one, because I bought the video on the street for $5 DVD because I believe in supporting black businesses, and I'm not going to give Hollywood the money. That's for damn sure. But I did need to see it so I can tell y'all what I'm telling you right now. Stop making them, but I am going to watch it, and I'm going to support black businesses when I can. So all these possessions, French possessions, like they possess this. Here's the point I want to make with this. Here's another map to give you something similar. And Howard students, if you're following along in your map books at this point, you're going to be around, let's see, you're going to be on map 85, the partitioning of Africa. The reason we're showing this one, this is by 1914, the eve of World War I. V.I. Lenin says this. W.E.B. Du Bois writes this in an article he writes in 1915 called The African Roots of the War. He's saying that part of this war they're going to fight in Europe is about who gets to possess the territories they've been trying to dispossess Africans of in Africa. The war is about resources as they want to dispossess. Remember, Germany is where they have the Berlin Conference, but Germany gets in late and they don't have a lot of territorial possessions. Although the first genocide, the first attempt to wipe an entire people out in this period, this 20th century, is not in Europe. It's not the Holocaust of the Jews, the attempt to destroy not only people of Jewish descent, but the Roma, the Gypsies, the black people. Read Firpo Carr's book, no relation, F-I-R-P-O, last name C-A-R-R. You can get it at Sankofa, called Hitler's Black Victims. I mean, so it is, but it isn't that genocide in the late third, fourth decade of the 20th century. It is the first decade of the 20th century. The war in German Southwest Africa, what they call Namibia now, the Herero. And they cut off the heads of the rulers and took them to Germany. In fact, the Namibians just got those heads back. It was a real struggle. Here at Sankofa, in fact, Sister brought up a film. She screened the film. We talked about that. Keep checking the Sankofa website. It was taped, so you may end up seeing that soon. Very important, since everybody's sitting at home. It's time to educate yourself about what is going on here. But this is the period when they're going to try to house and take over Africa. It's very important to understand, because this is just an example of these different colors represent groups, different national groups, language groups, cultural groups. And then you see the artificial lines of the states. So you're drawing lines as they want to take over Africa. They're making up countries, Nigeria, making up countries, Ghana. And you're splitting groups that speak the same language. So when you come here, the Belgians in the Congo, and then over here, Rwanda and Burundi, the Wahutus and the Watutsi speak the same language. One group herds, one group does agriculture. But now you're going to set up these tensions between people based on your colonial interests, so that when you come to the moment of national independence, when you're moving out, people are going to try to achieve national independence under this notion of political formations. This is kind of like the second wave of Pan-Africanism, post-1945. And we'll get into that in framing question 5. But for framing question 4, as we kind of wind to a close, what we're really talking about is this period when Africans become aware of European and American imperialism as something that they're not just experiencing locally, the Africans here, the Africans in the Caribbean, the Africans in Latin America, which we really haven't spent a lot of time on. We'll talk about that in the next lecture. The Africans in North America. They're not looking at it as a thing that's connected until they become aware of each other through improved technology. And when they do, some of it's political, some of it's cultural. Again, I echo Brent Hayes Edwards' book, The Practice of Diaspora. He's actually looking at the Nardal sisters who were in Paris in the first quarter of the 20th century, thinking about what one of the sisters calls black internationalism. Brent Edwards picks up on that term and really uses it as a way to talk about the fact that these black people are seeing each other beyond national boundaries. The best, most recent book on this, Hakeem Adi, again, as I mentioned. Brother did a great talk here at Sankofa. It was recorded. You'll be looking for it soon. He walked us through this history. I'm just going to give you a glimpse, Howard students, because you've been reading about this. Oh, there's Henry Turner, my man Henry Menil Turner. Again, we talked about Turner in South Africa, Turner in Georgia, Turner, Bishop of the AME Church, Benjamin Singleton, Pap Singleton. If you watched Watchmen and Regina King, you know about this Tulsa thing and Lady Night and the whole fantasy thing that they walk in the Watchmen. But the plumb line of Watchmen, that HBO series that perfectly ended at the moment, realizing something the Egyptians used to say, but you know, the black woman is God. I know, I'm going to get into all that. Some of y'all might call me a hotel, and then with just opening your mouth, put your brains on display, because I would challenge you to look through any of these texts, and if you want to call somebody a name, you should have read enough to be able to back up that insult. But Pap Singleton is one, Pap Singleton from Tennessee. In fact, Nell Irvin Painter, remember I talked about her a minute ago, writing about Sojourner Truth. She also wrote an earlier book called Exodusters. And Pap Singleton is one of the brothers. In fact, I'm just going to mention him very quickly, Howard students, because I think we might just have him on the final exam as I'm constructing it for this virtual community we're in now. Pap Singleton is on page 91. He says, in Tennessee, he's talking about immigration. They're going to leave these places to go other places. In the United States, though. In Tennessee, immigration was also in the wind, leading to the inauguration of such organizations as the Edgefield Real Estate Association. But, as that organization's name implied, the objective was not Liberia, but Kansas. The association was one of several organizations with which Benjamin Pap Singleton would be associated, the man who claimed to be the father of the Exodus. In time, from the mid-1870s to the late 1880s, Singleton would be involved with a number of groups, the majority concerned with immigration, meaning leaving one part of the country going somewhere else. Pearl Clegg, very important, the daughter of Albert Clegg, who we'll talk about in framing questions 5 and 6, Black Christian nationalism. Pearl Clegg wrote a play called Flying West, where she talks about Nicodemus, Kansas, Y'all probably heard of Nicodemus. If you go into the African American Museum, it's one of those historical markers that's right on the second floor as you're coming up out of the bottom floor, the all black towns. Very important to understand this whole black town movement. There were also Africans during this period, like a dude named Chief Alfred Sam. Chief Sam was going around the United States saying, we're going to Africa. Y'all meet me in New York, we're going to Africa. Never got there. The best book, in fact, the first book remains, I think, the only book on this as a book-length treatment, is a book called The Longest Way Home, on Chief Alfred Sam and the Back to Africa movement. This is before Garvey. Again, how do Africans perceive of this unity in thought and action? Menelik, 1896, Ottawa. Menelik is the emperor on the throne in Ethiopia when the Ethiopians defeat the Italians at Ottawa. Of course, Ida Bell Wells. Ida Wells out of Holly Springs, Mississippi. Ida Wells, who ends up in Memphis. If you're interested in Ida Wells, I would encourage you to read Miriam DeCosta Willis's edited the journals of Ida B. Wells, the Memphis journals, when she was in her 20s. I'll leave you with that. Very important. But Ida Wells travels to England to fight about lynching, to talk about lynching and what's going on. She is the pioneer of dealing with race terror in the United States in the 19th century. It's her that lays the template for the anti-lynching movement in this in this society. But she's a contemporary of many of these other people. At the same time, she's fighting domestically. She's also traveling internationally. She wasn't the first to go to England. Delaney was there. Frederick Douglass was there. Many other people have gone through connecting communities. There's Henry Sylvester Williams from Trinidad. Spent time as a barrister or a lawyer in South Africa. And then he calls a meeting in London of the first Pan-African Conference. 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 1900. Du Bois is there. Du Bois is there. He's born in 1868, so they're making 32 years old. I remember being in London in July the year 2000. The Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. We had our conference there because it was the 100th anniversary of the first Pan-African Conference. And at the height of the conference, they sent me over to Red Lion Square to go to the place because they were having a multi-day conference around the 100th anniversary. And I never forget, I got in there and gave remarks on behalf of the association, and I'm sitting there listening to these people in the same space they met. A. Sylvester Williams, Pan-Africanist, very important. A couple of good books on him. Look up Henry Sylvester Williams. These are black elites, but they're looking at Pan-Africanism not in terms of the nation states of Africa, because colonialism is still going on, but this kind of global Africanism that is concerned with the liberation of the African continent, but they're not born in Africa. Most of them are not. They're coming to that. And I never forget, I gave my remarks, and I'm listening, and they had a break. I went out, they were selling books, and I saw this big telephone-sized book, Ideologies of Liberation in Black Africa, 1850 to 1980 or something like that. It's a big old book. Rex Collins Press, Scottish press. So I bought the book. My sister was selling used books. That's why I ain't got no money now. I'm just buying books. So I'm like, man, this is great. Read, man. That year is when I came to Howard. That was the year I came to Howard, fall of year 2000. One of the first people I saw on this campus, I went looking for Suleiman Yam, the great Islamicist, African Islamicist who became my ancestor. He's one of the people, when I came to Howard, the Titans were still here, many of them. Ron Walters spent a lot of time with him. Of course, Russell Adams still alive. Holly Garima. I'm coming here looking for these cats. Henrietta Howland Garnett Edmonds. Yes. Henry Howland Garnett, her father named her from Henry Howland Garnett, and it says he spelled his with a Y. Her father spelled hers with an I. Henry Garnett, one of the great dramatists in our tradition. Al Freeman, so many of them. So I'll go into African studies. I'm looking for Suleiman Yam, the man. I've read his work. I see a door crack, and it says J.A. Langley. J.A. Langley. I knocked on the door. Come in. I'm looking for Suleiman Yam. Oh, he's not here. Okay. J.A. Langley? Yes, that's me. I said, Jabez Ayodele Langley? Yes. Jabez Ayodele Langley, who edited Black Liberation Struggles from 1850? Yes, that's me. Oh my God, I'm sitting here talking to Ayodele Langley, one of the great scholars of Pan-Africanism, working at Black University, born in the Gambia, now ancestor as well, passed away around 2007. These are the scholars, largely black colleges, who laid a foundation for the scholarship that is now coming out, talking about they're breaking new pathways. Don't do that. Don't do that. All right, let's continue. So here is the 5th Pan-African Congress. This is where we're going to wind to a close here. Why is that important? Y'all can't really see that picture. Du Bois, who wouldn't sit still, he's moving around. You can't really see him. I almost look like a ghost. This is 1945. And we're going to come back to this in framing question 5. But again, as we wind to a close for this framing question, how did Africans conceive of unity and thought beyond national boundaries in the face of European and American imperialism? They would often have conflicts. We didn't really get into the Garvey conflicts. Right? Garvey, Pan-Africanist. Garvey never set foot in Africa. Garvey had some of those Republican tendencies that Cedric Robinson is talking about, some internal critiques of blackness that can be kind of problematic. At the same time, a deep love for African people. Du Bois, some of the Republican kind of thing too, but he's more of a historical materialist. But when it comes to Garvey, he's looking at Garvey like, man, this dude is like with them unlettered Negroes. Them, you know, I mean, I love them too, but let's be clear, I ain't no real fan of the blues. You know, I got these bars opening every chapter of Souls of Black Folk. I understand the sorrow songs and all this, but this kind of unlettered folk culture stuff, man, I'm not sure. I mean, Garvey says, I came to New York looking for Du Bois. They started the UNIA in 1914, not 1916. Du Bois came to the United States in 1916 looking for Booker T. Washington because he'd read up from slavery. And, you know, he read up from slavery. He's like, oh, I like this idea of black independence. He don't know the politics on the ground in America. That Booker Washington is kind of with that conservative whites and these white philanthropists, Carnegie, Baldwin, and them. So he comes looking for Washington. Washington's dead. Okay. He goes down to Alabama. You know, he meets Emmett J. Scott, and that's a whole nother story another day. He goes to New York. He said, I'm going to go talk to Du Bois. He gets to the NAACP offices in Crisis Magazine. He said, I got there and I ain't seen any black people. And then maybe only after I left it, I realized maybe they were just light-skinned blacks. I mean, so this colorism is coming in. He got this whole class critique. Du Bois and Garvey beefing. Howard students, we read about that. We could talk about that more, but I'm kind of winding this to a close for now because I want to make this point. This is the 5th Pan-African Congress, 1945. Du Bois, who was at the first Pan-African Conference called by Henry Sylvester Williams in London, 45 years later, he presides over what they call the First Pan-African Congress, CONGRESS. He's called the father of Pan-Africanism. Yeah. Next to him, Amy Ashwood Garvey, wife number 1. Amy Garvey is there. Du Bois is there. For the first time, you see pause. This is not the first Pan-African Congress. The first Pan-African Congress took place in 1919 in Paris, right after World War I. What they're arguing for, these Africans who really weren't born in Africa, who were saying they want Africa to be free, they're saying we want the Europeans to be benevolent to the Africans to kind of help them achieve independence. You ain't got to leave right now, but you got some of them are saying that. You know, Monroe Trotter and them, you know, Trotter has to sneak over there. They want to prove him to go. Mary Church Terrell, Henrietta Vincent Davis, who's representing the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League of the World. By now, the UNIA got a delegate going over there. Du Bois is convening this one 19 years after the first Pan-African Conference. So Manchester is actually, because then they meet in Belgium for Pan-African Congress, this is the 5th Pan-African Congress. But this is the first Pan-African Congress that continental Africans from the continent are able to be at in a larger number. So you got young cats there like Jomo Kenyatta, who ends up taken as the first prime minister of Kenya. You got them in the space, right? And Nkrumah has now been on the scene. So by this 5th Pan-African Congress, we see that after the regional conflicts that we call World War I and World War II. So Europe has been fighting amongst itself and then drawing in major parts of the world. The limits of expansion, at least in terms of the old European imperial arrangement, seem to have been reached. And so they're fighting amongst themselves. By the end of World War II, we're on the threshold of the final kind of major iteration of Western dominance in global affairs. Because by 1945, of course, you've got other powers that are beginning to emerge. And that's beyond the scope of this framing question. Maybe we'll get into it in terms of framing question 5. Yeah, in fact, we will, because framing question 5, as we'll see in a minute, is how did Africans make sense of and participate in international developments? a little bit shift of focus, and it's going to take us deeper into the 20th century, for the second half of the 20th century going forward. And we'll get into the United Nations, we'll get into the kind of global institutions that emerge in the Western social structure. Also the rise of other actors. So we'll talk about Bandung, 1955, the Afro-Asian Summit, the rise of China and so forth. We'll talk a little bit more about Du Bois in China and other regions. But for this moment, to wind to a close for this framing question, students, Howard students, we talk about that Fifth Pan-African Congress. As this is, again, here they are in London. And here's Du Bois, Amy Ashwood Garvey, oppressed peoples of the world unite, Arabs and Jews unite against British imperialism. That sign alone should raise some questions for folks. Because you remember, by this time, 1945, it's still Palestine. You're not at the birth of Israel yet. And if you read Robert Weisborough's book, African Zion, you'll understand that the search for a homeland for Jewish people, at one time, the conversation included East Africa, Uganda, in fact. So it gets to be a very interesting conversation. But anti-imperialism is a deep there's a deep anti-oppression movement that extends beyond just African people. This isn't just people of African descent. There's a lot of solidarity politics in play in 1945, and this is at the same time that what's going to begin to emerge, of course, between the United States and its allies, its Western European allies, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and its allies, including China and others. You're going to see the so-called Cold War begin to emerge and play out. And some of these Africans who look beyond national boundaries, as we talked about in the previous lecture, the Robesons, the Du Boises, the Huntons, the Pattersons, other people like that, are going to get caught in this kind of domestic politics, even as other members of the black elite turn away from them. So, and they certainly won't be alone. There'll be other people who will be persecuted as a result, and other Africans from other parts of the world who are looking beyond national boundaries. Malcolm Nurse, who went by the pen name George Padmore, wrote the book Pan-Africanism or Communism, goes to Ghana, and spends time there and kind of looking through and critiques Nkrumah's emerging attempts to put together Pan-Africanism, even as he's participating in it. Africans from other parts of the world who are drawn in, everybody from Maya Angelou and David Levering Lewis. There he is again. In fact, there's an article in the American Scholar called Ghana, 1960, where you see these young Africans who were born in the United States going over there. Another figure is very important, Julian Mayfield. Very important to think about these figures. And there's a lot of scholarship on that. We'll talk about that in frame of question 5. But the point is that the Fifth Pan-African Congress, by then you see Garvey and Du Bois sitting side by side. Now Marcus Mosiah Garvey has died, 1940. Talk about Padmore. Padmore actually wrote an obituary thinking Garvey had died, and some people say that sound like Trump. Some people say if you read the scholarship on Garvey, and there's a lot of stuff on Garvey. We've directed you toward Tony Martin, but there's a lot more scholarship on him. Look at the Marcus Garvey papers. I think last volume I bought may have been volume 13, which focuses on the Caribbean. Robert Hill is the general editor, and one of the folks who participated on that, still on the Howard faculty, in the history department, the great Emory Joel Tolbert, still swinging, still producing PhDs. But you read the Garvey papers, you will be able to see how some of this played in terms of how the Western powers are surveilling them and so forth and so on. But by the Fifth Pan-African Congress, Garvey has been dead 5 years. He had been deported from the United States in 1927. He'd been arrested in 1925, sent to the Atlanta Penitentiary. Side note, I was talking to some brothers from Selma, Alabama, of all places, a couple of years ago, and they were telling me that they had spent some time in prison in Atlanta. They say on Garvey's birthday in August every year, there's a legend that there's a tree in the prison yard that they say Garvey used to go out to and talk to the folks, talk to the brothers who were incarcerated. And they say on Garvey's birthday, they meet at that tree. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I guess there's probably a way to confirm that empirically, to either prove or disprove it, but I'd hate for it not to be true. It would be a hell of a story, right? But at any rate, Garvey had been arrested in 25 on mail fraud. Whole conversation about that we could have another time. Justin Hansford, a young professor on the Howard Law School faculty, my former student at Howard, actually did undergrad here at Howard. Brilliant young brother. Was one of the lawyers who's working to get Garvey exonerated. Garvey's surviving son, his Marcus Garvey Jr. made transition, but Julius Garvey, Dr. Julius Garvey in New York, still fighting to get Garvey a pardon. Some of us say he don't need no pardon because he didn't do anything wrong, but if your son wants a pardon, then we all with Julius Garvey. And Justin and them have been with Brother Garvey trying to get that done, that elder. Barack Obama was left-handed, so I was going to say he could have signed that pardon with his left hand on the way out, and I guess that would have been appropriate because he's left-handed. I certainly hope Donald Trump, if he pardons Garvey, doesn't walk around and say he's a friend of the Negro, or that Negroes think he's a friend of the Negro and decide to do something crazy in the election, if there is an election. But Garvey and Du Bois are together on this, meaning that when Africans are making sense of and participating in international developments, you often find them at odds ideologically, but then they, separate, they come together. A strain we haven't talked about yet, Howard students, that you read about in Black Movements in America, is another strain of radicalism that's more closely aligned with socialism, and that would be the strain led by Asa Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph and his wife bankrolling it through her string of beauty salons until, of course, the FBI starts trying to shut her down and harass people. In 1925, the same year that Garvey is arrested and then taken to jail, to the penitentiary. I can hear Cat Williams saying, penitentiary is not jail. But at any rate, federal crime is why they say penitentiary. That's why they took Garvey to the federal penitentiary, because they said that he violated federal law through mail fraud through this trumped up charge that Justin and them have been trying to get cleared off the books. But in the same year, 1925, you have A. Philip Randolph founds the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Chambermaids. Howard students, you know that because you've been reading along in Cedric Robinson's book. But A. Philip Randolph is part of a Black internationalism that kind of has a class solidarity at its root. Just kind of going to see if I can find where I probably need to talk about him. Yeah, let me try to go to page 119 and talk a little bit about A. Philip Randolph. This is what Cedric Robinson has to say, among other things. He says, concealed beneath the racial sameness of the Great Black Migration was the fact that tens of thousands of West Indians, folk from the Caribbean, also responded to the appeal for industrial wage laborers. So this is the pull factor. Remember talking about the boll weevil in them? They're pulling people out of the South into the North. And in some cases, in this case, it's a deeper South, meaning off the mainland North America into the Gulf of Mexico, into the Caribbean Sea. Those people coming up into the United States. He says, among them were intellectuals, agitators, and organizers who pursued the dream of liberation and Black self-determination within the embrace of what they were persuaded was an international proletariat movement. In New York, Chicago, and as far as the West Coast, they sometimes in the most conservative institutions of Black higher learning, and sometimes in those institutions, they inspired young Black American radicals to imagine a vast global army arising to overturn the slavery of wage labor and the less metaphorical forms of oppression in the colonies of Europe, Latin America, and Asia. There they are. So they're looking at unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries from a class perspective now. We're talking about being informed. Remember the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. Goes on and says, some of these radicals had immediate and permanent impact on American social history. A. Philip Randolph, a Florida-born socialist and co-editor with Chandler Owen of The Messenger, led the organization of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925, forced Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II to form the Fair Employment Practice Committee, and later became a vice president of the American Federation of Labor - Congress of Industrial Organizations, the AFL-CIO. Who played A. Philip Randolph in The Irishman? I think they had a passing reference to him. But the movie you want to see, if you must watch a movie on this instead of reading, would be a movie called 10,000 Black Men Named George. Andre Browder, I think, played him. Charles Dutton is in that movie. It's the story of A. Philip Randolph and what he was forming in terms of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It's a good movie if you just, got some time. Other Black socialists conspired further from the political mainstream. For example, by amalgamating into the African Blood Brotherhood, the core of blacks in the American Communist Movement, the Communist Party USA. That's a whole nother story. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that in Framing Question 5, Cyril Briggs and those guys. But this is a commingling of Africans from the Caribbean and Africans from the United States. Now, these Africans from the Caribbean weren't with Marcus Garvey. In fact, they formed something called this collaboration that involves some of these folks, the Garvey Must Go campaign. They fighting against Marcus Garvey. But then you see 20 years later, 20 years later, the fifth Pan-African Congress, you see some of these formations coming back together again, including Du Bois, who had almost been shunned aside generationally by some of these younger people. We didn't talk about the Armenia Conference and some of the other things, because that same Franklin Frazier, also Ralph Bunche, and others, including Charles Hamilton Houston, who had a sympathetic ear for some of the communist arguments and critiques, particularly with his friend William Patterson. He's some of the guys who defended the Scottsboro Boys in the 1930s. The same Scottsboro Boys I told y'all in that previous lecture that Rosa and Raymond Parks are raising money for in 1933, 1932. Robin Kelly writing about that in Hammer and Hoe, and many other people. Rosa Parks talking about that herself. But at any rate, what you see is that these international ideas, these notions of unity in thought and action beyond national boundaries, are very familiar in black communities, and not just black intellectuals, and not just black people from the United States. There's a cross-fertilization of ideas. Let's win this to a close, because this is what's going to feed the fifth framing question. Oh, I'll put a little picture here. Here's some students at the W.E.B. Du Bois house. Those of you who've been to Du Bois's house in Accra, you know how our students go every year. Haven't been over in quite some time, but Dr. Amy Yeboah, good Ashanti, Ghanaian, who was on the faculty here at Howard University, also African American, leads the tour a couple of times a year, and had to postpone this coming one in May, but we'll be back to see you, Brother Du Bois, and if anybody's watching from Ghana, you know, we'll come see y'all again soon. Framing question 5 is going to allow us to get into an opportunity to view something that you'll see soon on the Sankofa website. You get a chance to view for yourself. Very important film by Shrikiana Aina, who is co-owner, of course, partner of Haile Gerima, the filmmaker. She too is a filmmaker. And this is like, in some ways, the documentary companion to, extension of, commingling with the film Sankofa. This film, Footprints of Pan-Africanism, follows what happens in the wake of 1945, but also goes over the history prior to 1945. So a lot of what we've been talking about these last couple of lectures is done magnificently with an artistic rendering, complete with interviews with elders, particularly Africans from the diaspora, who went to live in the newly independent country of Ghana in 1957 in this film, Footprints of Pan-Africanism. Stay tuned to this, particularly you Howard students. I might even, in fact, give you all this as some homework. You'll get a chance when it is finally ready on the Sankofa website to access it, view it for yourself. And if we get real ambitious and people get real stir crazy, maybe even have a real-time conversation with the filmmaker who's one flight below as we're recording this lecture today on what is now become Sunday afternoon. So let's do these last couple of slides and ride toward home. Couple of, we talked about Marcus Garvey, born in St. Anne's Bay, Jamaica, 1887, August 1887. Here he is, Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League of the World. Students from Howard, we talked about this extensively in other class. There's the Negro World, Improved Communications Networks, this newspaper. Love this header here. Got the Sphinx there. One God, one aim, one destiny. Yes, indeed. Will Negroes allow the whites to take Africa? Well, my God, I guess that's still the question, isn't it? Well, you might change out whites, but Africa, the land of hope and promise for Negro peoples of the world. This is from 1921. If you've ever read the Negro World, it's been digitized. You have full runs. The subsequent papers of Marcus Garvey, newspapers, The Black Man, for example, a journal he started after he had been put out of the United States, deported in 1927. If you ever want to look at that, y'all can search around online for Look For Me in the Whirlwind, which is one of the Garvey documentaries, and you'll see the Africans. Well, I don't know if there's anybody in that video who was present when Garvey left, but Sister Charles, whose father was the provisional president, talks about her father talking about when Garvey left the dock in New Orleans. And, that's one of the great pleasures of my life, being just old enough to have spent some time with Audley Moore, Queen Mother Moore, and to hear her talk about the way they protected Garvey when he came to Louisiana to speak, and how the Garvey movement influenced the reparations movement. So just a couple of pictures of Garvey. These are different areas in the United States that had chapters of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Biggest number of chapters were in the South. My very good friend, dear sister, Claudrina Harold, who is chair of the history department right now at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, brilliant scholar, wrote her dissertation and her first book on the Garvey movement. Does a lot of work on labor history, Southern history, and she traces that Garvey movement in the South. She, like A. Philip Randolph, a good daughter of Jacksonville, Florida, and also James Weldon Johnson, Jacksonville. And then the global map, because the Garvey movement was big all over the world. In fact, I remember one of the first classes I taught at Temple University as a graduate student, we went through where these chapters were and spent some time. At that time, there was a book, Yekutiel Gershoni, I think is the author. It's called Africans on African Americans. The whole book, I think he was a professor at the University of Tel Aviv at the time. The whole book is about how Africans on the continent looked at African Americans. So when we ask how do Africans make sense of and participate in international developments, there's a whole body of scholarship on how Africans on the continent looked at the Garvey movement, because the Negro world was not only distributed in the United States or in the Caribbean, which also had chapters, it was also distributed, if they could get it there, different parts in Africa. And it wasn't just in English, it was in Spanish as well. So then they would translate this into French or Portuguese, and if they caught you with a copy of it in Cape Town at the port or the dock or Lagos or Accra, you could get in trouble. You could get punished. You might even get jailed. But it was crazy because if you got one copy, Gershoni talks about the fact that, I guess it is that, it isn't Bernard Magubani's book. Yes, Gershoni. Been many years since I read Gershoni's book, but Gershoni says that there were cases where the Negro world would come in to, Cape Town or Durban in the east, and somebody would read it, and everybody would gather around and they would listen, and then the stories would get passed on. The paper would stay where it was, but the stories get passed on. And some of those stories got bigger every time they were passed on. It's like a game of international Pan-African telephone. And so they found black people saying, yeah, we heard that there's a black army in America that's coming to Africa and it's going to kill all the whites. Now contrast that with the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy, when they got put on trial, they said, we were told that if we could just get to the dock, a ship would come and take us to Saint Dominique. These are the freedom dreams of black people. You can't make this up. Some of you young filmmakers out there, make a movie about that. I understand all the other movies, but there's no need to make a Wakanda, and I'm a comic book collector, but they don't need to make a Wakanda when you can go back and tell the real stories and give black people hope based on memory. Hope based on memory is a beautiful thing, because Marcus Garvey said, what people have done, people can do. And that includes dream. So, that's going to do it for now for framing question 4. We are now at framing question 5. So the next time we see each other, we'll be discussing this question. How did Africans make sense of and participate in international developments? We'll still be digging in Cedric Robinson, Black Movements in America, chapters 4 and 5. We will also be completing, or getting close to completing, the Atlas for African American History and Culture, Units 6 through 9. It has 11 chapters. Unit 6 deals with, we've kind of dealt with Unit 6. We'll be focusing primarily on Unit 8 and 9. Unit 8, the growth of black political power in the North, the Great Depression, and blacks during World War II. And Unit 9, African Americans during the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement, as I said. Wole Soyinkas of Africa. We'll finally be digging into this. Chapters 5 and 6. This is going to be for our Ways of Knowing category, young people at Howard. Chapter 5, A Choice of Chains. Chapter 6, Not a Way of Life, but a Guide to Existence. This is in part 2 of Africa, and will also give me a chance to integrate something from Wole Soyinka's newest book, Beyond Aesthetics, Use of Use and Dissonance in African Art Traditions. In fact, I would read these two together if I were y'all. But, and we will return to Kwei Armah, The Eloquence of the Scribes, chapter 17. The Eloquence of the Scribes is the name of that chapter. Chapter 18, Myth as Cultural Resource. Chapter 19, The Dance of Inspiration, very important. And then the chapters dealing with institution building, which really kind of like a governance structure conversation. Chapter 20, Per Sesh, Freeing Social Oxygen. Chapter 21, Per Ankh, The Home for Life. Chapter 22, Negatives, The Colonial Publisher as Pirate. Those of you who are fans of the Heinemann Press series, there's a book by the publisher of Heinemann called Africa Writes Back. So if you read Things Fall Apart, or Bessie Head's work, or who they used to call James Ngugi, now Ngugi wa Thiong'o, all those books that were published in the African Writers series and in the Caribbean Writers series, Derek Walcott, so many others. You know, the publisher of Heinemann wrote a memoir, and he said, of all the writers I had to work with, I enjoyed them. They were all great. The most difficult one, though, among those great artists I worked with, was Kwei Armah, because Kwei was always fighting about the business end. Well, in this book, Kwei Armah tells you about getting all his copyrights back from the publisher. Those of you Sanford and Son fans remember Bubba, I want my daddy's records. Or in the case of Sam Cooke, I want my masters. Or in the case of what Fat Joe told DJ Khaled, own your masters. But you know, it's very important. Chapter 23, positive, pointers from experience. Chapter 24, in praise of companions. We'll end on that because it's important to understand as we close for this lecture that we are in a challenging moment. We are in a virtual kind of distance, at least physical distance. But this is an opportunity for us to engage in this deep work of study. That's why Kwei wrote this. What Baba Kwei wrote this book. And the ones that have come after it, The Way of Companions, very important. For the Freedom School students, if you're watching this, know that's the book we read last summer after it just come out. We had read it together. It's important to understand that we can build collectively. We're going to party collectively. I see everybody tuned in to DJ D Nice's Instagram party last night. At the same time, there's no reason we can't do the same kind of thing when it comes time to studying. We'll see each other Howard students because we're required to do that. You know, you're here, you're paying tuition, and it's an honor to be on this faculty to help us through this challenging time. For everybody else, we are under no such command or requirement. We do this voluntarily, and this is indeed the work. So until next time, until the next lecture, see you soon. Hotel. Peace.